Hi, everyone. It is 11 o'clock. Welcome to the Python Education Summit for 2020. I am here with our wonderful committee that we're going to be introducing as well, and with virtual applause to the committee members who cannot attend. Thank you all so much for coming. I know this is a hard time and it's hard to extract lengthy amounts of time for yourself during the day. So we so appreciate you signing into this event and attending. It's going to be sort of a different format. The virtual was no one's plan, but here we are, and I'm glad we can have some version of the summit this year. This is always a really important event for me personally and professionally, and so I'm glad that we can have some moment of connection in our year, and looking forward to staying home right now so we can all be together again next year. I'm going to let Jackie pop in for a moment and do some housekeeping. Chalmer, if you can go to the next slide.
Hello, everybody. I'm Jackie Augustine, a PSF staff member that will be sitting in as monitor for Code of Conduct. So this is my reminder. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody and glad you can join the Education Summit today as part of PyCon Online. Hope everyone is healthy and safe where they're at. So as the guidelines state, we ask everybody to abide by the PSF's Code of Conduct. Not just today, but all the time. And we want to create an environment where folks feel safe to contribute and speak up. So I appreciate you doing that for the duration of this event. There are links there for the Code of Conduct, which is on the PyCon website under About PyCon, and also an email address if you want to report anything. And just as a note, this is being recorded. Names, unless you're speaking, are not shown on a recording, just so you're aware of that. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you so much. So the next slide, please. Whoa, sorry, my son is building a castle behind me right now. So welcome to Zoom. I'm gonna go over a little bit of Zoom etiquette for our event. Please, for bandwidth purposes and for recording purposes, only the speakers should have their video on, so keep that off, please, if you are not speaking. Please also keep yourself muted. We have pretty loose permissions for this session. It ran pretty cleanly yesterday at the Trainers Summit. I will be monitoring the chat and monitoring participants and doing muting as necessary. So if you accidentally become unmuted, can't figure it out, I will be there to take care of it for you. Please keep the conversations in the chat. So right now, everyone is welcome to say hi and where you're logging in from right now. But once we actually get into the speakers going on right now, my video is not on, baby, so don't try to show them toys. Thank you. So, hey, Coral. Awesome. I love seeing some names I know and names I don't. I'm super excited to hear from everyone as well. Once the speakers get going and start presenting, please keep the chat to just really talk specific things, and please try to avoid commentary or other discussions happening while the speaker is presenting. Some speakers try to monitor the chat while they're talking, and it can get kind of distracting if there's a lot of chat going on. So you're more than welcome to throw a question in the chat, and we'll start that out. We'll work on that in the queue. Once the questions start, we should have like 5 to 10 minutes of question time after each talk. So please go ahead and put that in there. If you have a question and then you need to bail before the speaker's done, go ahead and throw it in, and we'll address it, and everything will show up in the recording. So with that said, thank you so much. Again, I will monitor for muting and keep discussions down when the speakers are going. And then now I will give it over to Meenal to start sort of the other welcoming remarks.
Education Summit since last summer. I was involved with the committee the previous few years as well. So I'm glad that we are able to do this in an online fashion or a virtual summit this year. I'd like to introduce you to some of the committee members who have been involved in the planning of the summit. So my name is out there first. I've been involved with the Education Summit for as long as I can remember. I think it's around 2013. I started doing PyCon then, and I just got involved with the Education Summit. Being a teacher myself, I teach middle and high school students. I teach them coding. And in my full-time job, I'm at Google. I'd like to introduce Chalmer Lowe, who is one of our longest running members of the Education Summit. He's the founding member. Chalmer will be talking to you very soon. And he works a lot in Python, data science, and currently he's at Booz Allen. Elizabeth here, who's our wonderful host, she has been involved in the Education Summit last few years. She's at University of Illinois, and she's an educator, working heavily with Python. Meg Ray is another one of our committee members. Many of you may have heard of her. She's written a book, Code in Game, and she is a teacher in residence in Cornell Tech, and she has started their coding program or computer science education program there. Laura joined us this year in the committee, and she helped us a lot with the outreach work that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. So shout out to this committee. They've worked very hard over the past year, and I'm glad that we are able to present our work in this format to you today. So the next slide, please. So we had a few main goals for 2020. One of our goals was to increase participation. So we are looking to engage with educators, students, technical community to understand how Python is used, how it can be used in teaching environments. We would love to hear about how Python is being taught in the school environment by teachers, in the college environment, what kind of tools there are. And that is what we like to look for in our talks and in our lightning talks and in our sprint sessions. Those are some things we'll cover very soon. I just wanted to point out some data points. So in 2020, I just found out from Elizabeth, we have 104 signups for the virtual summit. We had 53 submissions. We had 8 mini sprints, 18 lightning talks, and 27 talk submissions this year. In 2019, we had 135 number of signups. We had 58 submissions, where we had 17 mini sprints and 41 talks. And then we had, in 2018, we had around 135 signups again and 40 talk submissions. We have 160 submissions in person every year. So I'd really encourage folks to sign up for Education Summit, come up there, meet us there, and see how we can grow this channel in the Python community. For our outreach this year, we planned a student showcase with local schools. This is where Laura was very helpful, and she took the lead on this. So we had actually planned with 6 local schools in Pittsburgh. We had planned poster presentations and breakout sessions. I hope that we can continue this in 2021, and you will get to see some of our schools participating in the Education Summit as well. This year, we also introduced new sessions. We experimented with that a little bit last year, but now we have defined categories of the new sessions. Apart from the talks, we now have lightning talks, and we have mini sprint sessions. Lightning talks are 5-minute talks that allow you to present an interesting tool, your experience, anything that is fun and small, which would not matter for a full talk. And mini sprints are these breakout sessions, which are moderated sessions where you can take any topic and discuss that at length and come up with some meaningful action items. So with that, I will hand off back to Elizabeth for the next slide.
Great. So again, the virtual summit was not our plan, and thank you so much to our wonderful speakers who were able to pull together a version of their talk that they had the bandwidth for. Being in the education community, we were particularly impacted because nearly every one of us had to do a ton of work to get their materials online. I know I spent 3 solid weeks getting everything prepped My spring break was not a vacation. My spring break was doing a lot of video editing. So, and thank you so much we have a couple of talks that are going to be recorded and will go up in the YouTube channel as well. So, we have a couple awesome talks this morning. After we're done with the welcoming sessions, we have Chalmer who's going to do sort of a meta talk, which is going to cover a little bit more about the Education Summit and looking at some future directions we can take this in. Then we have Zoe with engaging digital learners and data science practices. We have Jeffrey who's going to talk about how Fu and Bar must die. I'm really excited for that one. I'm really excited for all of these. And then Piper is going to come in and talk about building an API specifically for teaching. We have a couple lightning talks at the end, and we had a couple of speakers who weren't able to pull together something for a live session or weren't able to attend the live session because we all have commitments we can't really change right now. So there's a strong chance we're going to be ending earlier, about an hour earlier. I'm certainly free to stay a little bit longer, and if there's discussions, if there's sort of collective screaming we all need to do about how hard this is right now, we can handle that. It just depends on how many people want to stick around, but certainly if there's anyone who wants to talk shop about live coding online, etc., you know, I'm a librarian and I teach Python. I am here to help. So plan on sticking around if you're able. If you're not, everything's going to be recorded. Next slide, please. I do also really want to specifically highlight these talks that are going to be in the process of being recorded and uploaded. We have using Python to improve physics curriculum. We have a talk from a Steel City Codes lab, which is a Pittsburgh specific talk, and then writing unit tests as an initial part of learning as well. So there's a couple people who are still not sure if they can put together a recording yet. So I'm doing my best to work with all of the speakers to get them going. So as everyone should be forgiving of themselves right now, please be understanding of our speakers that they're taking out and carving out hard portions of their time to get these talks going. So I'm looking forward to everything. Please keep monitoring both Twitter and the PyCon 2020 YouTube channel for these upcoming recorded talks. And then I think we're over to Chalmer now.
Excellent. Thank you, Meenal. Thank you, Elizabeth. Super excited to be here. It's a little odd to be doing it this way, but we'll make the best of it, see what we can come up with. As we on the committee that runs the Education Summit, we're kind of thinking about things and looking at how we can shape the direction that the community goes. We had an idea of potentially doing a meta talk, a talk maybe about the summit and kind of what goes into the summit. And I volunteered to tackle that. And I wanted to share some ideas with some folks about what do we do to execute the summit, what goes into making the secret sauce, if you will, and how folks can help with future summits, the types of things that we need assistance with, and maybe some of the places where we can continue to grow and shape the summit so it serves the audience more effectively and more efficiently. So with that in mind, dive in. All right. In terms of committee roles, by and large, we've typically labeled ourselves as a chairperson for the committee and then a whole selection of co-chairs who assist, right? But that doesn't really point to what kinds of things we do. When you sit down and look at the committee and you look at the types of roles that we've had over the course of time, we have mini sprint organizers, we have lightning talk organizers. On the day of, we have folks, who serve in various MC roles. Especially when we're in a venue, we have kind of a gopher type who runs around and makes sure that the wheels stay on the bus. Throughout the course of the year, we have public relations roles that need to be filled, folks to write blog articles and or to publish social media postings, folks who need to reach out to try and ensure that we are reaching an audience that can provide us speakers, right? Reaching out into underrepresented groups to help them be aware that, hey, this is a speaking opportunity and we're looking to hear from them and see how they're influencing and affecting their teaching environments where they are. And then of course, we need talk reviewers. People provide proposals and the committee has to go through and review those. And that's a heavy lift. That's probably the biggest consumer of our time, all right? I'm going to talk a little bit more about these roles in just a bit, but by and large, that's what we end up doing. At various points during the Education Summit this year and in previous years, we've talked a little bit about our goals, and I wanted to touch on that just a little bit, right? When I envision an Education Summit, and I think about the mission of an Education Summit and the mission of a committee that helps to run such a summit, my thought is generally focused on how can we leave you, the attendee, with something that's going to improve your ability to teach, and how can we leave you with something that will enable your students to succeed in applying Python to their problems, right? And so as the committee makes decisions about what to do, who to reach out to try and encourage speakers to submit talks, which talks we want to select, what types of things we want to include in the summit. It is kind of this overarching philosophy that helps me make decisions, and I think it probably drives a number of the other folks on the committee as well. I will tell you though that I've got one real goal kind of hidden behind the scenes. Chalmer's real goal is to not say the word pedagogy more than one time in this entire talk. So we'll see how well that works. Now, when folks show up for something like this, right, they arrive at an Education Summit. Typically, there's a couple of things that they're really expecting. They'd like to see some good talks, things that will leave them with something actionable that they can go home with and to try, to implement, to apply. And they hope to have good experiences. I think that was part of the emphasis, right? To have things like mini sprints where folks can get together, they can sit face to face, and they can talk about problems and they can talk about solutions to those problems. Right now, in the middle of a global pandemic, right, some of our ideas about, hey, how do we get folks to talk face to face got thrown for a loop a little bit, right? But nonetheless, we hope that through delivering this Education Summit, there'll be mechanisms, and we'll share some of those mechanisms in a little bit, that will help us to continue to grow our networks and find folks that we can commune with and we can work with over the course of time. Now, having said these things, like, what do you want, or what do attendees typically want? Let's talk a little bit about what you get. We've tried a number of things in the past 8 years since Naomi Cedar first started the original Education Summit. We've always had talks. We've tried lightning talks at various times. Last year, we kicked off mini sprints. In the past, we've done some unconference sessions. And for those who are not familiar with unconference sessions, those are where the actual attendees sit down and propose ideas on the fly in the room. And then they vote on them and they decide, what are we going to cover for the next 45 minutes or next hour? And then we have group discussions. Again, that was kind of focused on trying to get engagement where people are talking to each other. And the education committees focused ourselves on trying to find, amongst all of this mix, right? How can we find good topics that will resonate with the attendees? And we've covered the gamut, right? Everything from first year to 12th year types of curriculum, collegiate education, content for folks who are teaching in, say, a commercial environment, maybe with corporate clients. The big ticket item in the Python world is data science. So we've looked at how do you teach data science? We've looked at talks that are focused on the beginner. And I use beginner to mean two things, maybe a beginner instructor. Where did they start to teach someone? As well as beginner students. What are the types of things that a beginner student needs to see or hear? We've also looked at talks geared toward the advanced practitioners. Some of my favorite talks were ones that were geared toward hardware. How do you take hardware and bend it to your will? We've looked at the tools and libraries that you can use to teach more efficiently, or so that your students can do their work of learning without all of the cumbersome, headaches of dealing with complications. We've looked at what types of techniques work and what types of techniques don't. Another one of my favorite topics is, how do we teach on a shoestring budget, right? There are places in the world where folks quite literally are working in impoverished conditions and trying to educate folks. So that's what you've gotten from us. And in some cases, right, we've done a good job. And in some cases, we've been able to deliver what folks want. But once in a while, we get a little bit of feedback. And it's, come to our attention that we can't really please everyone. But nonetheless, we do the best we can. Some of the feedback that we've gotten has been focused on things like, I really wish that we had more time to discuss topic X, or man, I was really wishing that you would have covered topic Y. Once in a while, we get some comments to the effect of, who thought it was a good idea to put that Chalmer guy in the room? But I generally don't take that too personally. I did want to talk a little bit about how do we make the choices as a committee of which talks we want to put before you. It is a little bit harder than one might think. We start off with a variety of criteria that we try and look at. A lot of times we'll look at a topic and we ask ourselves, is this new to our audience? Is this something that we've covered before? Didn't we have a talk about this last year? We look at, and sometimes we'll get repeat visits, right? Somebody will say, hey, I talked last year and my project has advanced and I'd like to give you an update. And sometimes we are interested in seeing those updates, but we will weigh the merits of maybe looking at an incremental update to a tool or a library that our friends and family have already seen versus showing them something new that we haven't seen before. So we have to kind of make those value judgments, right? We also look at whether or not something we're seeing is innovative. Maybe it's an innovative approach. Maybe it's a new tool or different techniques that haven't been tried before, or we haven't had a chance to talk about before. We got a number of folks on the committee who are really focused on education and the principles associated and the methods associated with teaching, right? And so we try and make as best we can, based on the limited information we have in a proposal, on whether or not folks are applying valid principles and methods for teaching, right? As opposed to somebody saying, well, I thought this might be a good idea. We try and look for things that essentially model proven techniques for teaching people complicated technical topics. All right. We also look at whether or not topics are universally applicable, right? Or whether they're hyper-specialized. As much as possible, we want to try and get talks that are going to be broadly applicable to as many members of the audience as we can. But then we also want to, on occasion, bring in some topics that may be a little more niche, because we often find that bringing together niche ideas or niche topics and putting them together in ways that people didn't anticipate or think about tends to lead to innovation and growth. So we have to kind of weigh that balance as well. And this item, it's last on the list, and I put it there purposely because I wanted to talk maybe a bit more about this particular topic, and because it's very dear to my heart. From the very first days of the Education Summit, there has been a strong focus on trying to ensure that when we make selections of talks, that we do the very best that we can to ensure that we're presenting talks that are diverse and inclusive, right? The PSF's focus on things like code of conduct, right, and helping ensure that everyone feels included in these conversations, I think is a strong measure greatly needed in the tech community. And I'm glad they do that. When we look at talks, right, if we see talks that maybe are, use terminology or things in, say, the titles, et cetera, I'll talk more about that in a bit, that might be charged or whatever, we tend to try and get a sense of what's going on and how that might impact the audience. in terms of diversity, right, we're fully aware that we can't just expect that folks are going to show up. So when we're planning out talks, we start off with how do we ensure that folks from a wide variety of backgrounds, underrepresented and otherwise, know that they can give talks. And we start out with a public outreach to groups to let them know that their membership should feel confident about submitting talk proposals. So we try and fill the pipeline as best we can from the beginning, so that way we have a diverse pipeline that we can then select from. In many cases, right, as we're kind of evaluating talks, we're looking at things like, the quality of the talk proposal. I'll talk about that in a second. And in many cases, we kind of down select a little bit. And then as we make the final choices from the down selected talks, we layer in this nuance of, are we able, through this selection of folks or the selection of talks, able to provide a diverse set of ideas, topics, and explanations to the audience. By and large, I feel like we've been pretty successful, but I definitely know that there's more work that needs to be done. And I'm hoping that you folks are going to be able to help us with some of that. We'll talk about that in a second as well. What are some of the things that kind of get in the way of doing this talk selection? Well, the number of talks proposals that we get is fairly limited, right? We would love to see even more people submit talks so they could speak at the Education Summit. The submission quality varies pretty widely. We get some talk submissions that are incredibly high quality, and they're always amazing to read. And we all get really excited when we see those things. But we also get some submission quality that's pretty much the bottom of the barrel, right? Maybe a sentence or two like, here's my topic, you should select me, kind of a submission. It may be an interesting sounding topic, but there's not enough detail there to help us feel confident and comfortable that if we select this person to speak, that they're going to deliver a talk that is engaging and enjoyable to you, the audience, right? And the last kind of barrier to doing this really, really effectively and really well is, to be honest, the criteria to the left on the slide is a little bit subjective, right? They're value judgments. And our selection committee is a small group of folks. And we'll talk about that too. I'm going to shift gears for just a second. I talked a little bit about kind of how we're selecting talks and how we're trying to build a quality education summit. But I want to highlight how the folks in the audience who want to speak at, say, a future summit can submit an effective proposal, right? How can you get it so that your talk is selected? And I'm going to cover a couple of points pretty quickly. A lot of these things come out of a talk by Jesse Davis. I'll have a link to his talk here in the slides in just a couple of minutes. The first thing that helps us when looking at a talk, right, is getting a sense that this talk will be educational, that it will be enjoyable, and will be broadly appealing to the audience. If a talk, even in the written description, just seems like really boring or like, oh my gosh, even trudging through the written description didn't seem like I was going to enjoy this talk, right? That's hard for us to select that particular topic. So as you're writing up your proposals, trying to figure out ways to ensure that you're presenting it in a way that is appealing to both the reviewers and convincing to us that it'll be appealing to the audience that shows up. Another concept, right, for helping to ensure that your talk gets selected, choosing a really good title. Your title is often the first thing that the reviewer sees, so that's going to set almost this instantaneous bias about what the talk is going to be like or how the talk might approach topics. It's also going to be the first thing that an attendee sees, right? Do I want to go listen to this talk? So we often recommend that folks avoid cliches. Things like do X for fun and profit, right? That particular title has been used thousands of times, right? Pick something new, something entertaining. Things that are, say, hyper politically charged, sometimes that alienates your audience before they've even had a chance to meet you or to think about coming to your talk. Like something, or make something great again, right? For a lot of folks around the world, very politically charged types of commentary strike them as disingenuous or cause reactions that bias them against the talk or even considering going to the talk, right? So choose titles that are welcoming, titles that are engaging, and that will capture people's attentions. For us, the folks who are reviewing the talks, the things that help us to make some of our big decisions are the abstract that you write and the outline of what you intend to cover. Those should be very specific. They should be realistic, well edited. By specific, right? You want to cover the details. I will look at A, B, C, and D. I'll probably not cover F. This is geared toward the following types of audiences. You want to be realistic. You have 20 minutes, you have 30 minutes. Don't try and explain to us, or don't try to imply that you're going to be able to cover 59 topics when you really only have the time to cover 3 or 4. So be realistic about what you can share. Make sure it's well edited. We get many, many submissions that are not very well edited. They're hard to follow. They're hard to understand, difficult to parse. And then help us understand that you really are what we'll call the expert on that particular topic. Give us some evidence that your bona fides are there. One of the ways you can do that is by being really clear in what you're going to cover. I intend to talk about this topic for about 5 minutes. I'll then cover this topic for 4 or 5 more minutes, kind of break it down so we have a sense like, okay, you know the topic, you know how long it's going to take to cover particular things. In your outline, provide sub-bullet breakdowns so that we understand, okay, when you say you're going to talk about this is what you really mean. And all those things help us to feel comfortable and confident that you're going to be able to present and present well. A lot of talks, PyCon and otherwise, give you a chance to put a blurb in, like a note to the organizers. And I fully recommend that you take advantage of that. If you have previous speaking experience, share some of that with us. Maybe provide links to a YouTube video of a previous talk, so that way we can have a sense of how well you do. Also be honest, if you're brand new to speaking and you've never spoken before, let us know. We're always looking for junior speakers or green speakers, right? Folks who've never done this before, because we'd like to hear fresh voices and see fresh ideas. So let us know. That helps us to kind of, again, make decisions about diversity. Do we want to hear from the same old person who's been doing this for, decades, or would we like to hear a fresh voice this time around? Or maybe we'll choose, someone who's been around and somebody's new at this, so we can kind of compare, contrast, those types of things. Help us make for a more engaging experience. And lastly, and this is probably the most important thing, get some help. Have somebody review your proposal. We occasionally get proposals, and you can tell nobody looked at this besides the author. Find a friend who can help you with the technical editing, somebody who can help you ensure that your proposal is compelling, and will encourage us to want to select your talk. All right. So with that, I've got 2 links on the page. The first one is Jesse Davis's talk, where most of those tips and hints came from, but also on PyCon's own speaker page. When you go and submit a talk proposal, right there on our speaker page, there's about 4 or 5 different articles very similar to Jesse's that walk you through tips, hints, suggestions on how you can really put forth a robust and vigorous proposal, right? Okay, next. Every year, especially at the close of an education summit, we get feedback from folks. It falls into kind of 2 main categories. How can I help? And I want to help. And as we talked about the roles and types of responsibilities that we have, the chairpersons, people who review talks, people who help organize the mini sprints or the lightning talks, etc. certainly there's enough work to go around, and we would love, absolutely love to have additional people assist us. Most of the folks on the committee have kind of been doing this for a number of years, right? So having some fresh blood to help us come at this from new perspectives and bring different ideas to the table would be absolutely amazing. So you might say, well, why isn't it easier for people to help you folks? And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that, because I think if we can, as a committee, engage folks who want to help us, it will benefit the entire audience. And so the first thing that I'm going to throw out here as just an idea, right? If you have an inkling, like, I would really love to be part of this education committee and really help out the community. If you're able to, if you already know some of your strengths, et cetera, be specific about what you'd like to help with. That really makes it easier for us. If someone shows up and says, I want to help, that means we need to stop. We need to figure out, what are your strengths? What are your capabilities? Where can we fit you in? What's going to go on, right? So we have to kind of stop doing what we're doing to come and assist. Not saying that we shouldn't do that. It's just, you know, an additional burden or obstacle that decreases our ability to assist you in getting involved, right? So if you can, be as specific as possible. If you have some experiences that you can share with us to say, hey, I'd love to help you with this thing, like talk reviews. I've been doing reviews for this other conference, or I did reviews for a journal, et cetera, et cetera. If you can share with us some of your experience, that really helps us to feel a greater level of confidence and to welcome you in to do particular things. If you're really junior to all this and you're like, you know what, hey, I don't know what I'd like to do. I don't have a whole lot of experience in certain things. That's okay. I don't want to scare any of you folks off. Just let us know up front. So that way we know that we can, or that we ought to take a little special care to kind of help guide and shape the direction of your participation, right? But the more you can help us to set expectations, the easier it'll be for us to engage you and help you be in there. I will also say be persistent, right? In a gentle way. We're all volunteers. None of us get paid to run the Education Summit, right? This isn't our job. We're here because we're passionate about it. So if you send out a note to one of us and you're like, hey, I really want to help, and for whatever reason, maybe there's a global pandemic or something, and we fail to get back to you, you know, don't panic. Don't think that we're not interested and we don't want your help. Just be persistent. Ping us again. It might have slipped off the radar. I talked to, or I mentioned to the committee earlier today via email, the content here on this, essentially the last slide, about something that I would really love for the committee to focus on over the course of the next year. And I would really love to see the community at large assist us with, so that when we get together 12 months from now, we can bring to the table an education summit that is even more diverse, that is bigger, better, and even more beneficial to the attendees. So what do we want to work on? I recommended to the committee that we look at codifying our best practices. Some of what we do right now is a little bit ad hoc, right? We kind of done this enough times that we know it in our heads, but it'd be really great if we could kind of document a few of these things, especially so as we welcome in junior members, they already kind of have an idea of where things are going to go and how things play out. We want to look at some other types of committees and see what best practices they have for how they execute things like talk selection, et cetera. Would love to see us document some of these roles, responsibilities, and the time commitments that people can expect from them. So if somebody does show up at our doorstep and says, hey, how can I help? We can point them at, well, here's 12 different ways that you could help. This one's going to take, you know, a limited amount of time. This one's going to take a lot of time and effort. This one probably requires some healthy experience to get started on, but this one you could do with no experience whatsoever. So it'd be great if we can document those things, and then people can kind of pick and choose from a buffet to say, all right, well, with this in mind, I would love to do X. I would love to help you with the following thing. I think it'd be really great if the committee, which has always kind of worked under, again, kind of these timelines that are in our heads, if we can start to think a little bit more about how do we break down the 12 months between one PyCon and the next to execute and make it so that when we get to crunch time goes a little more smoothly, streamline some of what we do. I'm also excited the idea about cataloging some of our boilerplate messages. Every year we kind of communicate out to folks, and sometimes we reuse some of the messages from previous years where that makes sense, but I don't know that we've captured all of them. I don't know that we have a good collection. And the point behind something like this is, right, just save ourselves time and energy. We send the same types of messages year after year. We should make it easier to deploy some of those. And I think it'd be really great to codify some of the guidelines. Again, when I talked about the talk review process, some of those things are a little subjective. It'd be really nice if, especially following some best practices of other folks who do talk selection, if we can codify a few more of those things, especially so as we bring in additional talk reviewers, right? We're all working from the same sheet of music. So how does this apply to you folks? We would love to see greater community involvement in helping to execute each of the education summits going forward. We would love to see some community involvement to help streamline some of our processes. And we would love to see an increase in, some of the diversity of thought, et cetera, both in the committee itself and amongst the speakers and amongst the presenters. So with that, I'll wrap up and turn my time over to our next speaker. I appreciate you folks bearing with me.
Great. There's a couple more slides in here I think we can cover really quickly. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what has happened, what I've been able to see that's happened in Python education in the past 12 months. Next one up. And I do want to highlight that the PSF awarded its first round of education grants in the past year. So there were 3 that went out. I think one was not a funded grant, but they just wanted PR. So the 2 funded ones were one with Beware to improve Python on Android, because as we've seen in prior summits, that having the mobile device ability to code on a mobile device has been really impactful across many communities. And then Meg Ray also received a grant to help create the Python and Education website to collect sort of resources about education and educational information out there in a community. And she's going to be giving an update about this project later on during our lightning talk session. The third project was friendly tracebacks to make tracepack easier to read. And there's like the blog post from the Python Software Foundation to read a little bit more about each project. They're awesome. I would just please encourage all of you to consider, as you're able to donate to the PSF. They've definitely lost a lot of revenue this year with not having the in-person event. And we were just starting to get the educational efforts spun up. So please consider donating a little bit of money to them. Next slide, please. I also wanted to highlight the Python Educators Slack group that was created last year as well. We had a bunch of new subscriptions yesterday from the Python Trainers Summit. I will be posting the joining link in the chat here pretty soon in just a second. So this is a resource. We have channels for K through 12. We have general discussion and announcements. There's a job board. There's resource recommendations. I have a little reference desk channel that I made as well. There's a group for industry trainers and many more. And we're open to whatever you need as well. So please make that use of that resource and stay connected. It's really hard to get our communities connected, and this is not a perfect solution, but it's one that's been effective over the last year to be able to communicate with educators working in the Python space. And I think I'm going to end it at that. And we are going to thank you to Chalmer for talking about what it's like to get the Education Summit going and the difficulties we're presented with. And thank you everyone who submitted this year and everyone who's thinking about submitting and helping out next year. I want to go ahead and invite, so I think Chalmer, we're done sharing the screen, invite Zoë Wilkinson Saldaña to speak. I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host so you can take the mic and share your screen. And Zoe's going to be talking about, let me get the thing going. Oof, where'd my schedule go? Engaging learners in critical data science practices. So Zoe, the floor is yours if you want to start. You should be able to share your screen now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Chalmer. And hello, can folks hear me okay, see me okay?
Looks good on my end.
All right. Hey, everyone. I also just want to echo, like, I'm really glad that we're all here doing this, and I hope that you're all making it through everything okay. This would have been my first PyCon and my first PyCon Education Summit, so I would have loved to enthusiastically, awkwardly waved at you across the room or whatever, and instead I will do that through my computer. Oh, and excuse me, just there's a lot of sirens right now. I'll wait just 3 seconds. Yes, also, one benefit of being at home, one downside is that there might be some noises, one benefit is that my cat might show up. So anyways, hi, I'm Zoe, and I'm here to talk today about engaging learners in critical science, data science practices specifically. This is something I feel really strongly about, and that I have spent some time lately really focusing on thinking through how do I do this in my teaching practice, and how do I learn from the work being done from some people I really respect in this kind of domain, and then how can I share some of the things that I've learned as I've gone. So again, hello, this is who I am. I work as a data instructional specialist at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. So it's kind of like a funny little position in a research institute in a children's hospital. I'm partly an instructor educator directly, but I'm also someone who kind of builds educational programs. So those mindsets will kind of be on display today as we talk. I also sort of started in AmeriCorps as somebody who taught beginning computer classes in public libraries. So how do you double click? How do you use Wikipedia? How do you, get going from the very beginning? And that is something that I find very important, is always thinking about an individual and their goals and trying to find just the real human connection and some of the silliness that comes from just us all beating our heads against these machines, trying to figure out how to move forward. I mentioned my cat, Jane. I also like competitive pinball. So these are just some things about me. And today we're going to talk about critical data science practices, but why? So I wanted to give you a bit of context for some of my experiences going through a data science education program and starting to teach, and where I see some real opportunities for us as educators, as Python folks, as this kind of special intersection of educators to kind of take leadership around critical data in particular. So I'm going to talk a bit about my experiences as a graduate student at the School of Information. I had a really positive experience in this program, focusing on being a librarian, being an educator, and being a data scientist. Those were kind of the threads. And I will just quickly give you a content warning here. I'm going to talk a bit about, in general terms, data to sexual harassment and assault, just for about 3 minutes. So just want to leave that on the screen for a moment, but in kind of in a broad sort of way. So I was in this program, I was in my last semester, I was doing a group project with data visualization, and we could look at different data sets, kind of real world data sets to visualize. And one of the data sets was this really interesting and very powerful collection of survey submissions on sexual harassment in academia, which came from this blog The Professor Is In, which you may have heard about before. It deals with labor issues and equity issues in higher ed. And so this was in just a few weeks, this was a survey that gathered thousands of responses. So it was people's experiences with these really awful situations largely within their departments as graduate students. And so our group, which was women, non-binary people, and queer people, we were, frankly, some of us just didn't feel equipped emotionally to spend the next month looking at this data. So the group didn't look at the data, but I was really struck with how powerful this data was, and how it was open text. So it was data that wasn't I wasn't immediately sure how to kind of start to sort of work with it. And so I used my toolkit that I had learned as a graduate student as a data science person. So I had some of this text analysis toolkit. I could do things like topic models, which are shown in the top left, showing about the mental stressors of these incidents. Or I could think about this as a classification kind of task on the bottom right, using a machine learning pipeline with PySpark, the Python implementation or API for this Apache Spark framework. So I had these like technical tools in my toolkit, and I wanted to say something with this data. But I realized very quickly that I actually didn't know how to think about and conceptualize the value of these approaches relative to other ways to make sense of this really powerful data and these really powerful individual testimonies. And I had these big questions about why would I pay attention to the outputs I was creating? Why would I pay attention to these topic models? Why would I value these in a particular way instead of the narratives themselves as a whole narrative? And then beneath that, I had this question, which was really what makes a method powerful or useful? And I realized that in the context of this program, which I feel very fondly towards, I had spent a lot of time learning about some of these things on the left side, like how to think about selecting a model or optimizing it, how to sort of deal with messy data, kind of things of that nature. But I didn't really come up with a framework, or didn't really develop a way to think through what is inquiry? Like, what is uncertainty? How do I deal with asking the right question? And how do I even think about how I would know about that? How do I get at issues of power and exclusion? And also, this was something that was happening in a conversation happening at that moment. Like, what does it mean to study something happening in the moment? And how do I contribute to a community usefully through this? And so these questions I really sort of found troubling, but also in a way motivating. I wanted to answer them. And I had this kind of other space. So I was in student mode, I was going through the course load, I was going through the sequence, but I was also an intern that whole time in this studio called Digital Project Studio, where we were encouraged to sort of work with the data in different client projects, different projects we were writing about for essays and blogs. And my mentor, Justin Jock, who has just a really wonderful critical mind, theoretical mind, really helped me think through what I wanted to sort of how I wanted to think through learning to start to answer these questions. And I'll actually kind of sort of stop it there and not necessarily go into my conclusions, but just to say that this arc I went through really made me interested in saying, yeah, I want to be somebody who can help a group of students look at this data set of things that really matter and that are really relevant and they can make an impact. But I want them to have some of those tools that I didn't necessarily have access to at that moment. So when it came time for me to figure out, as an educator, okay, I'm going to work in libraries, I'm going to work in nonprofits, I want to teach these skills. As many of you are interested in teaching these skills, I really didn't know. So when is the time to ask these questions? Like, when is the moment to bring this up? And so I want to focus my talk today on this answer, which I'll give here, of always, of I think that this is something that we can work into all of our teaching, but it does require us to think through, like, what does it look like to really to model and to propagate an idea of data science that is critical at sort of every level. There is some really powerful work going on right now of people who are thinking about this and working towards this in design justice communities, in social sciences and feminist, in even the computer science worlds, who are thinking through these issues. And I think that as educators, we're at a great time to start to enact these things and to learn from people who are already enacting these things. So the framework that I really feel like, if there's one like kind of touchstone that I think would be helpful for you all to run with as well, is sort of this feminist data framework. So this comes from a paper in 2016, and just as of last month, there's this book, Data Feminism, which I've just kind of started digging into. It's fantastic. But the ideas here are these imperatives about rethinking binaries, embracing pluralism, especially this element of power and aspiring to empowerment. So these are some of these sort of imperatives of how we might conduct data science in a way that is deeply feminist. And in particular, feminist can mean many things. Here, there's this real engagement with power. There are other thinkers. Tammy Oliphant is someone from the library world who also thinks about the case for critical data studies. And so what I want to extract from, flashback here for a moment, what I want to extract from this kind of set of imperatives is really a couple of key pieces here about critical data science practices that engage with power at all levels. So I wanted to kind of focus on this idea of how do we sort of work towards engaging power? And you can think about this as feminist data science, engaged data science. I really recommend Ignacio Klein's data feminism framework for folks who feel inspired by this. And so what I came to is that when we're thinking about these practices, so we're in the Python world, right? So we are drawn, of course, to the technical. We're drawn to ways of dealing with this through the toolkit that we've assembled around. But I'll argue that, that we're at our best when we can also, as educators, draw on the reflective practices that will aid that, but also thinking in terms of labor and community. This is where I, as a newer educator, have really tried to grow and learn from mentors who can focus on the content, like the what of critical, but also put into action equitable practices and thinking about labor issues as they go. So that's kind of the steer things. And for the second half, I'm going to give you some examples, I think, of where we can turn for inspiration and some things that I've sort of learned that I find concretely helpful. So the first is this idea of incorporating reflective practice into everything that we do. So I'm really excited to talk a bit about Naomi Alterman's work. So, and I think that she's with us in the community as well here today. So she has this great quote about the truth is a single unit in an introductory machine learning class about bias is like thoughts and prayers after a tragedy. It sounds nice, but it abdicates our responsibility to systematically heal the problem. So she was going into a new sort of machine learning bootcamp kind of style course sequence and had this opportunity to structure it and to think about things like ethics. But I really respect this kind of sort of reaction to this ethics unit, which is that it's not enough. So her kind of solution, or one of the ways that she sort of thought about this, was why don't we incorporate some of the toolkit from things like storyboarding and think about how do we get learners to actually reflect on the life of the systems they're creating. So she had them, so it's shown here visually, but she had students actually like answer these questions in their narratives, their analysis of like, in this worksheet alongside their analysis of, imagine people who are positively affected by this model, people who are negatively affected, actually kind of imagine the life of this model as a writing exercise. And what's really interesting is that, students struggled with this. They had all kinds of reactions to this, but some of the students reported, from this great article, which I recommend you check out, some of the students reported being able to better understand their own motivation to be someone in the future, being someone who implements machine learning models, but also somebody who in the future wants to do this in a way that's responsible, in a way that thinks about the sort of the effect of these models. And so Naomi puts forward this idea of, it doesn't have to be exactly this type of worksheet, this type of activity, but that this is a good sort of tree to bark up. Like this is a good practice because it kind of creates these situations for learners that they maybe have never been asked to do in the entirety of their sort of technical education here. And so I think that when we translate this to what we can have access to, I know many of you are involved with teaching with notebooks and Jupyter. I think that there's some really strong resources around this. Teaching and learning with Jupyter, which I realized that Elizabeth is one of the co-authors on, which is really fun, is a great resource for digging into pedagogical strategies. There's my pedagogy reference with Jupyter notebooks. And specifically what I found in my context now, teaching in medical research, is that there's this big picture interest in changing the conduct of research so that there's more openness, there's more collaboration and transparency, and we can start to think through issues of the conduct of research because people share their process. And what that means like on the ground is having people from the very beginning, when they're doing something like cleaning data or searching for nulls is the example I've often used, to really design lessons that really foreground making explicit all the steps that go into that type of cleaning and sharing it as a narrative that can be sort of reproduced. That's kind of like a whole strategy and family of techniques that I found to be helpful towards this. And to go on that last note, so I really believe strongly in this idea that the way we talk about data cleaning is, if there's one thing that I would change just broadly about data science, it's for people to really recognize the intense intellectual labor and contribution that is working with quote unquote messy data. So messy data is not just a problem to overcome, right? It's actually the context in which we understand how data relates to reality. And so to speak specifically of a type of program that can sort of engage with this, as a librarian in upstate New York at Cornell, I was part of a group that planned these sort of summer fellowships for humanities and social science students who were basically trying to build something in 6 weeks, like a digital project, and trying to kind of take their own trajectory and try to take their own data and try to create something new, learn a new skill set. And I bet many of you have worked with students in this kind of case before. They're really excited. They have a vision of what they want to do. And as educators, I learned a lot from working with Eliza Bettinger, Michelle Paolillo. This was a really lovely crew. We did 2 summers of this. We spent a lot of time in this, here's a dramatic reenactment, which is taking these projects and taking the written description of the data that people had and literally breaking it down into all the different steps that we saw would have to happen to make these projects successful. So if people were trying to do network analysis, there might be web scraping. So then there's this scaffolding of Python and data and things like that. And so in going through this process, what we kind of learned was that there is so much rich work to be done. I mean, so on one hand, it's that feeling in your gut of being like, can we pull this off in 6 weeks? And I think the sort of the thing that we came to is that no, there isn't going to be quote unquote operational success in 6 weeks. There's probably going to be a prototype, right, of some output of an analysis. But by really focusing on the data process itself and leveraging some of these, like teaching Python to start to scrape data or work with texts, really spending time on front loading the data piece. We spent 2 weeks in intensive workshops every day to learn some of those skills, and then 4 weeks in building mode, working individually or in kind of affinity groups. What we learned was that at the end of the summer, students had a prototype that they felt good about, but that they're interested in, but they also felt much more tied to their data. And so it was really helpful because it made me realize like, oh, my contribution as an educator isn't, I need to make sure you can build this thing at the end. My contribution was, we've created a context where you can own the specificity and the conflicts and the nuance of your data, that you can champion that, and that you can go forward and feel more confident, maybe giving a talk about it in the future. Maybe you can teach an undergraduate course about that in the future. Maybe you can take a job that now has to do with some of these elements of programming. So that really kind of changed my perspective on what we do, what kind of counts as critical. Is it just content, or is it this transformation in how we're doing this work? And so the last piece, I know I only have a few more minutes here, is that we want to situate learning in community. And I think that, a lot of us, some of us may be coming from teaching in specific like courses, and then some of us might also come from these in-between spaces. And so I wanted to ask just, so when you think about what are the communities that shape your practice right now? So right now you might have some communities you draw from. This is kind of what my world looks like here. I learn a lot from different groups. But when you think about what it was like as learners, you may have had fewer frameworks to draw on. You may have had fewer kind of communities to bounce ideas off of. It may have looked something a little more like this, where you had your classroom, your department, your discipline. And I think a lot of folks who are learning data science are learning it in these types of environments right now. And what I wanted to kind of sort of draw our attention to is that we have this like amazing strength, being folks who can be both teach in traditional, and some of us are teaching in libraries, some of us are teaching different programs. I have this, I'm in the hospital world. And I think that these spaces that cut across are extremely powerful for really recognizing and affirming that our learners are also doing the labor of learning. And one of the ways that we can support them, in addition to the content being critical, is to do things like, oops, I think I'm probably out of time. Okay, oh, there's that comment there, great, thank you. Yes, please share your communities that you're part of in the chat. I think that would be wonderful. With my last minute, I'll just say that I'm interested in drawing out here just that we have some unique opportunities. Like the fate of, or the fate, the kind of the way that data science is formulated is not set. And I think that there's a lot of activity going on in these kind of in-between spaces. And one thing that we can do is pay people, is find ways to get money into the hands of students, to support them, to own these things, to create those spaces like I had as a student. And that is also a vehicle for equity. So thinking about not just when we design workshops or curriculum, but how do we collaborate with designing those programs themselves or those spaces. And the other piece is that when we are part of communities, we can start to sort of rev up and learn more about critical perspectives and draw on our folks. And I wanted to share just my last thing here, just that visualizing the future is a the name is very speculative fiction, but this is a community of librarians who are teaching data visualization. And what we're doing right now is we're building up some example repositories, some pedagogical materials. We're trying to increase the ability of librarians and other folks who are, again, maybe a little bit between, who are helping with data visualization and wanting some support and framework. We're trying to say, like, yeah, this is a point where we can support each other and we can build out some materials and we can get critical. We can really create the capacity to think in these terms. So if you're curious about how might I teach data visualization and how might I do that with a critical framing, I recommend checking out what we're doing. We're gonna release a lot of the stuff over the summer that we've been working on for the last almost 2 years now. And so when we get to the last question, who gets to shape data science practice? You might be able to guess the answer that I'm gonna put forward here. It's that we all do. And I think that if we do that with intention and sort of, again, find ways to bridge what we're doing in content, in courses, with this mindset of working across these different axes, I think that we can help sort of maybe reframe some of this practice. And I'm really interested in learning from you all who are already doing that and connecting. So anyway, so these are just kind of the points that I went through here. Feel free to reach out to me at all. I'm a newer educator. I'm very much learning from my mentors and from my colleagues, and I would love to collaborate with you and learn like what this might look like in practice going forward. My cat Jane wants to ask you all, what questions do you have? So, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We have a couple, we have like at least one question in the chat already. If you want to go ahead and throw your questions into the chat, for the purposes of the recording, I will read them off for you.
Oh, yes.
So the first question is, do you know a person at CHOP? He's also in the medical. So he's recommending a person for you to connect with.
Oh, wonderful.
I don't necessarily want to say that person's name
yes.
in the recording, but
yes, I'll look at that after the session. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So as anyone, this is also while people are thinking of and typing in questions. So I'm also a library science person. I teach in a library school. So this is amazing to see the work that can be done. And this is definitely, we teach data science in our program as well. And we think about these things all the time. And we have a class called data science storytelling because it's so important. The communication is just so important.
Wow, that's.
So I would love to continue the conversation and collaborate. And
yeah. And I'd be curious if you don't mind sharing for just a moment, Elizabeth, if you've seen any changes in the last few years of I guess the teaching around data science, if it has been a space of change for you.
It's hard because students are so driven by what recruiters are looking for, especially the data science students. And they have this strange perception that life is Kaggle, and that you download a data set, you jam on it, you come up with just sort of that accuracy rate for their model is the end all be all, rather than really critically questioning it. And what you said earlier was also being able to develop an original research question that can be answered by large scale data that you may not be collecting yourself. I created a class just on this entire process, just on like the research question development and data benching process. And it is hard.
Yeah.
It is hard for everyone. It is hard work. So I unfortunately haven't seen a ton of change, but I'm starting to see a trickle of data science students seeing more of conversations like this. So there's more interest. It's just sort of really hard to get the Kaggle out of them.
Yeah.
And there's a question in, how do you get more diverse representation in the education space for subjects like data science?
Yeah, and I think that what you're sharing here of creating sort of networks and communities where we can learn and amplify the work is huge. So I really appreciated, I got to talk to Naomi a bit about her work as well. And it was really I think moving to realize that, you know, there are ways to be creative and take risks that even are in the heart of, you know, a Google-backed sequence of a bootcamp style machine learning sequence, right? Like there's a lot loaded into that, sort of like culturally and ideologically perhaps. But I think seeing that as an opportunity to be like, well, it isn't, as you're saying, it isn't like we have to live in Kaggle purgatory forever, right? There is space for being creative and reframing how we do that. And I think that seeing this as a longer journey, a longer struggle, I think is really valuable, and just being humbling. You know, as someone who's newer, I love to rush in and try my own inventions sometimes, but stepping back and being like, I want to listen to what's going on around me has been helpful. Yeah.
We do have some time for a few more questions. I can also say that we've been doing a lot of sort of corporate visits for students to and listen, and having the people, the data scientists on the ground saying that communication and storytelling is super important has been way more, like 500% more impactful than us telling it to them. So
Interesting.
this is also a call for the data science practitioners to say that that is super important. All right, we have a long question in here. Thank you for bringing the concept of power into the conversation. Learning to program gives you power. Some people are conscious of that from the beginning. It's why they want to learn about programming. Some people spend their whole lives oblivious to the power they carry. A question to share with the students is, what will you do with the power that you are gaining from learning to code? How will your choices affect others with less power than you? And how will your choices affect those with more power than you?
I love that.
Those are excellent.
Thank you for that. That is, I think that stands alone. I think that's fantastic to ask. Yeah.
So another comment coming in. I'm really interested in following you through visualizing the future. I'm collaborating on 2 new courses related to data visualization and would love to incorporate the research from the fellows. I would invite you all to join on the Slack, and maybe we can make a Slack channel for some of these sort of resource developments and things, so we can all kind of follow each other and showcase the cool stuff.
I would love that. And
I don't know where else to send people, but
no, and we're still getting to the sort of delivery phase of this fellowship. So, but it's you know, things are happening. So please keep an eye out. I love the idea of participating in Slack. And I also just wanted to frame that, you know, in my own, so again, you know, I feel like I've spent an inordinate amount of time as an educator, like having those moments of like staying up till 2 a.m. trying to find the perfect real world data set and like obsessing over my notebooks and kind of in this mindset, this like tunnel sometimes around content. And I think it's so important to get those things right. But honestly, I went through the carpentries training recently, and I think that was really helpful for me to realize that it's not just being quote unquote real world isn't like the be all end all of this stuff having impact, because one, there can be some real downsides to overly focusing on real world, like data that people aren't prepared. Like sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and to give people the set of tools to you know, the practices to work with data. So it's not like just finding the perfect real data means justice and equity and we're done, you know? And so that's one piece. And then the second piece is that if we take some of the pressure off that, or we share resources, it gives us more latitude, I think, to combine what we do with data and practices in the classroom and pedagogical practices with, I think, these sets of things like, you know, figure out in our institutions, what kind of institutional intervention should be in place. Or as I thought about kind of like, how do we get people more money? You know, how do we, I think, Lizzie, you bringing up the idea of like, if it's like an issue of getting, you know, people who are already in this world, they're already in this profession, to get them in front of students and create those kind of back trickling pipelines, how do we do those things? And I think that building that shared capacity together kind of frees us up sometimes to let those be solved problems, and then focus on some of these other ways of thinking about learning and education.
Yeah, we always need to keep in mind that students are responding to the incentives and pressures that they are going after. And especially with the economy and jobs right now, students are all the more, they're going to weigh what a recruiter says way more than what we say. And so part of the community development is ensuring that in having conversations with those recruiters and the people on the ground and the interviewers, that like, you really please talk more about the rest of your work with them, because they are going to listen so much, and we need to respect that of them as well, and understand where they're coming from. So we had one last question from Meenal. For someone starting out in data science in the medical field, what would be a good starting resource?
Oh, that is a great point. So I would say I like the suggestion of kind of start wherever, you know, if you have any colleagues or any sort of in your own unit or sub kind of subfield, if there's any work being done, try to sort of look at some of those and understand sort of what's going on. Like I like to search for things like notebooks or reproducibility in the field. So find some research, find some people who are advocates. I think that this is something that I'd love to see the Python world work, you know, match the R world with sometimes. I feel like sometimes some of these voices end up being R voices on things like Twitter, where I end up finding, oh, here's a person in this subfield who's kind of an advocate of R, and they have this kind of approach. So I like to learn by seeing examples of what people are doing. The other thing is that with something like Python data science, I think starting with something, whatever version of your learning style works the best for you is great. So if it's an intensive workshop or a MOOC or a carpentry program, just start somewhere. Start doing a little bit, and then have a conversation with someone who, again, that you might be interested in seeing their progression, seeing kind of what they've learned. And maybe I always find it to be motivating when you can kind of set some goals for yourself that lead towards someone who's already rocking it in a way that you would like to rock it professionally, or perhaps already are, but want to continue to draw upon. So start where you are, find some research, find maybe a mentor figure. I'm also always happy to chat with anyone and share the things that I've learned. I'm still a newbie in this field as well, for sure, but I'm happy to always chat with people if that's of interest. So.
Awesome. And we have the resource channel, and I love doing like programming reference interviews. They're so good.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay. Sorry, I could just jam on like library data science so much. Right. Can we get a wonderful show of emoji applause for this awesome talk? And I think we can get your slides up as well somewhere, because I know there's a bunch of awesome links in there. We are now going to take a quick break. We're going to come back at, for me, 12:30, but for you, N30, whatever hour it is that you are in. Shout out to the night owls that are joining us. We had someone from Singapore staying up from like 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. for us for the Trainer Summit yesterday. At 12:30, we're going to be coming back and hearing from Jeff Olsen about how foo and bar must die. So thank you so much, and you are off the hook now.
Yay, thank you, everyone. This is a great experience. Take care, everyone, for a minute. Bye.
Alrighty, it is 12:30 or N30, whatever hour you're in. Hope everyone had a reasonable little break there. We're going to go ahead and invite Jeff to go ahead and screen share and take the mic with his presentation.
Howdy, folks. It's great to be here. Give me 20 seconds. Can I just get verbal confirmation from one of the other hosts that we can see this?
Looks good.
Beautiful. All right, I'm going to present in this mode. And we should still be okay. All right. Welcome. Thanks for being here. We are about to jump into a session that I call Foo and Bar Must Die, How to Teach Less and Do More with Context, Predictions, and Playtime. Here are my course stats. It's a pleasure to meet you all. I'm glad to be here. I'll let you peruse that on your own. You can call me Jolson. It is a helpful disambiguation. There are a lot of Jeffs out there in the world, and so most everyone who knows me professionally does. I also thought it would be useful to talk about why you might or might not want to listen to what I have to say. My background is in English and math teaching in high school classrooms, mostly 9th and 10th. My undergrad work was in neuropsychology, all of which to say I really love thinking about learning. This is something that I'm deeply passionate about, and so I'm excited to talk with you all about it today. I've spent the last 3-ish years as the Director of Curriculum and Instruction at Upper Line Code, where we are aiming to transform education by making computer science accessible to all students, regardless of race, gender, or income. I absolutely love teaching, especially computer science, and especially for individuals who come from underrepresented groups in tech. I'm deeply passionate about this work, and I'm really excited to be a part of it. I learned by making mistakes, all of which to say this may be one of them. I'm sure there is at least one thing I'm going to say that is wrong. I'm asking both for your patience and for your feedback in that regard. I taught English for 4 years and math for 3. So most of my experience in public school classrooms was not in a computer science discipline. Most of that came in the intervening summers and now in my full-time role teaching smaller, shorter, immersive classes. And I'm also not a paid developer, so I'm going to recommend at least one line of code that will make a paid developer cringe. I apologize. That's the best I've got. The reason that I wanted to talk about the way that I was taught to teach is that I feel like I was given a bad model. The core of it was basically start simple and build up. You're familiar. I give students something that we do together on the board, then send them off to work in small groups, and then send them home with homework to do on their own. This was the exact model that my high school geometry teacher had used on me. And so I was confident that because it had been so successful in my education, that it would work really well, and it did not for my students. It was supposed to look something like this. I was going to show the key vocab words that we were learning that day, give them the definition, take all the guesswork out of it, then show one or multiple examples, then have students create their own. I put that in green because all the PDs that I was going to at the time were telling me create as a depth of knowledge level 4 skill. And so as long as you're having students create, they'll master it. Then repeat those steps for every single one of the words we needed to master in that English class. Then give students a multiple choice quiz, in other words, a puzzle that they have to solve using the knowledge they've just learned. And then I added in step 7 myself, which is despair, as most students struggle with this sequence because it simply wasn't working. The students in my class were bored during my lessons, they were stressed during my examinations, and they were overall unsuccessful in my content area. I think it's because I was asking students to memorize really specific small differences in the vocab words I was asking them to master long before any of those differences actually mattered to them. And students didn't know why, which is fair. So I think the solution actually was to make the vocab useful, to find situations I could put my students in where the vocab word of the day, whatever concept we were learning, was actually the knowledge they craved in order to move forward. So this is where I've ended up. Start with a puzzle, and then ask my students to make a prediction. Once we've played with that for a little while, then I send students off to create something based on that puzzle, usually in collaborative groups. Then we come back together and I'll show my example, what I've done. Done well because I want them to see code worth emulating, but also done with humility, aware that I am not perfect and also that there's not a lot of benefit in presenting a perfect model first out the gate. And then last but not least, once they have this working definition, this mental model already built, paste on the vocabulary and the definitions last. That way they can talk about what they've learned later. When I started doing this in my math class, we hit measurable gains for the first time in my entire teaching career. So for the first 3 years in a row, at the end of every single year, I was working 80-hour weeks as first, second, and third year teachers do. And my students were performing exactly on par with the rest of my school district on their end of course assessments. And it was really discouraging. And then when I switched the model in this way and started with these puzzles and let students work their way through it, I had measurable gains. We outperformed the district by about a standard deviation. And it was really encouraging. I also noticed that this is actually just an inversion of the gradual release model that I was being taught in Teachers College and in the PDs. So the model that I was handed started with vocab and worked its way towards this puzzle where you actually use what you've learned. And this thing that I don't have a great name for, I'm going with conceptual convergence for now, starts with the puzzle, and then at the very last stage introduces vocabulary. So this is not something that I created. I did experiment to get close to it, and then I heard a talk about it that I thought was fantastic. They call the model PRIM, which stands for predict, run, investigate, modify, and make. And I cannot give enough credit to this org and the research they've done around this topic. Please investigate the Primming blog and see some of the preliminary work they've done. I think it's great. The catch for this model to work is that the puzzle you start with has to be good. And so this is where Fu and Bar are going to come into it. This is the first puzzle I present to students. We do this after about a minute of coding, so it's early. As long as you name things well, it works. I've yet to meet a single student who didn't predict that particular code puzzle well on their first try. So first I ask, what will print? I give them a chance to write down. Then I ask how they know. And then once we've run the code and seen that, yes, they were right, then we talk about why is hello in quotes and why is name not. It's wild. Every single time we come to some understanding of why we might use quotation marks to print something that we literally want printed, and we would skip the quotation marks if we wanted to go look something up, as a word students use a lot. And so this gives us the core working understanding we need to talk about strings and variables really productively. Once you've done that, name them badly. This is my favorite example to ask right afterwards. I ask students, will it still work? Why or why not? And then, once we've proven that yes, it will still work just as intended, I ask them which variable name is better, and I ask them to tell me why. So where do foo and bar come into this? They're everywhere. Every time you ask your students to Google something new, it is really, really possible that the first 3-4 things they see are going to have things like foo and bar peppered throughout, and they're all over Stack Overflow. This is an introduction to classes from a really well-respected guide that I am heartbroken by. I'll give you a moment to absorb it. You have a class called my class. You have a variable called variable with a string that says blah. You have a method inside that class called function that returns a message from inside the class, and then you instantiate one. Like, we could pick apart why this is bad, but it is really concerning to me that this is in the top 5 results that pop up when you Google Python 3 class syntax. This is another one, probably much worse. And no one can parse this without already knowing everything at play. So the solution to this, in my view, is context. You can make more complex code seem simpler than any of those examples that we just looked at by adding context. This is the introduction I use to classes. I'll give you a moment to look at it. I usually ask students to read over it for maybe a full minute before asking them to do anything else. And then I ask them what will print. Everyone gets it, first try. I ask them how they knew. They can explain that pretty well too. And then the last thing is, I'll switch the question. I'll say, what would I write if I wanted to get the word Jeff to print, and how did you know that? Their working understanding is really only maybe 10% of what you would need to really effectively use objects, but they do understand how these properties fit in, and it's really cool to see it unfold. See, context allows you to read from the bottom up. You start with that end result, and you can eventually pick apart the nitty-gritty pieces that made it possible earlier on. Context allows you to use your outside knowledge about the world, about users, about emails, about usernames and passwords, instead of checking that knowledge at the door. So I'm hoping to share with you all a guide that I use to recognize missed opportunities for context in my own examples and in documentation. Foo, bar. I hate all of them, and so here are my offerings for you to revise these things up. If you find yourself using names like myString or str, you're definitely missing an opportunity to layer some context into your lesson. Ask your students what their favorite song is at the moment and have the variable be lyrics. If you're not using the string for anything important anyway, like, why not? The lists. Everyone introduces lists in documentation with a list of numbers, which blows my mind because you're about to use numbers as the indices to look up those values. And so seeing my list bracket 0 and seeing that 4 will come out is not nearly as intuitive as seeing which one of these artists is my #1 favorite artist. You'll see in a second. Variables like x, unless you are literally talking about the x position, why not give it a name for whatever value you're actually keeping track of? Same with floats. And again, when you ask students what's going to print when I do my list number 2 versus my artist's number 1, students are far more able to wrap their head around and make good predictions around an artist's than they are around a my list. That said, I also want to take a step back and recognize that not all context is created equal. Here is another example that I almost want to give credit to. I almost want to cheer for, because they're definitely trying to let students use their wraparound knowledge instead of checking it at the door. In this case, we have a dog class. It has attribute 1 and attribute 2. It has a method that will let it describe itself, I suppose. But the core complaint I have is actually that just dogs aren't digital. The way that you make a dog is by like giving 2 dogs time. You don't make a dog by running a class like this. And so I want something that is actually authentic in its real context. I also have lots of smaller complaints in gray underneath. The words attribute 1 and attribute 2 aren't inherently meaningful. The fun method doesn't make a ton of sense. These variable names don't make a lot of sense. So we can dig into that later. But I think the core piece that's missing is an understanding of why I might use a computer program to create a dog. So we're going to zoom out and talk about pseudo context, which for many of you, if you are an educator, especially in the math sphere, you definitely know this word. It is something that Dan Meyer, who is the founder of Desmos, uses to describe situations where the task you're being asked to do or the tools you're being asked to use feel bad because the context that they're layering onto it isn't real. We'll dig into this in just a second. But basically, if you're asking an unnatural question, if you're asking students to do an inauthentic task, or if you are offering them an unhelpful tool to get that task done, you may have offered them pseudo context. I'm going to give 2 examples. Oh yeah, credit to Dan Meyer. Example 1. In January of the year 2000, I was 1 more than 11 times as old as my son, William. In January of 2009, I was 7 more than 3 times as old as him. How old was my son in January of 2000? I hate this problem for a couple of reasons. I will list them. Why do we care about how old your son was in 2000? Why don't you know how old your son was in the year 2000? Who keeps track of ages in terms of multiples of other ages at certain points in time, but not the actual ages themselves? Why is this the set of information you have? And last but not least, I know, because I am a math teacher, that you want me to set up a system of equations. But even as a math teacher who has facility in that skill, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to guess and check because that's the easiest way to get it done. So asking students to do something that isn't interesting to do and asking them to do it with tools that aren't well suited to the task is a good sign that in an attempt to dig up a real world application, you've actually found pseudo context. Here's another one. I'm actually going to go to chat for this one because I want to hear your answers. This is the photo that accompanies a math problem from a textbook that says real world connection. Can you guess? I'm not going to tell you what level of math it is, but can you guess in the Zoom group chat what math concept is being taught by this photo? I've got vectors, area of a cone. Logarithms, chaos theory, these are great. Yeah. Ooh, I love this. Triangles but like finding ways to accommodate for differences in the shape, velocity. These are amazing guesses. I will let you keep going if you want, but I will also reveal it to you. If you guessed area of a parallelogram, you're correct. So when you look at this problem, one of the things that you'll notice is the map shows the region under the state that is under a tornado warning. What is the area of this region? Even as a math teacher, why would that be the question I would ask? I might ask, is my house in this area? But I'm not going to ask, how big is the area of the warning? And I also am not at all sure if tornado warnings are issued in parallelogram shapes. So that's like a separate thing that I have to look up. It's not confirmed here. This is not the point of the focus of my talk. It is just what I find to be a really powerful thing, and also really humbling when it forces me to take a step back and look at my own examples, because I'm sitting on this high horse criticizing this example, and I'm also well aware that I've done the same thing in my own work. So let's go back to object orientation to close out. That dog class that I showed you actually led me to design a player class. And that felt more realistic to me, because the idea of building maybe a role-playing game where you attack someone and you have defense as a Dungeons and Dragons player, I thought maybe this will be really relevant and really meaningful. And it turns out that assumes that my students share my context and my interests. And it inherently is going to bias towards everyone who already feels welcome in the field of computer science. And so if I want to do my best to make a space that is welcoming and affirming for individuals who have historically felt alienated or unwelcome in this space for computer science, I need to be aware that the context that I'm layering on as I'm trying to offer them space to make these guesses, make these predictions, actually makes room for that. And so I have 3 recommendations for real context that doesn't alienate some of your students. Number 1, give them an authentic task. So in this case, the user class is concrete but not physical. It scales way faster than individual variables, and it even has a built-in exploration of self. So digging into all of these meaty pieces of object orientation while knowing really concretely what each piece of this is probably supposed to do, you're ready to go. This is kind of the core of what I'm hoping you walk away from this with, is students don't actually need simple examples, they just need clear ones. Next, please provide them authentic tools. This is an example of a visual I have in my mind. So the units are nonsense. This is just like an abstract representation of what I feel. But let's pretend the red line, the prior concept, is just individual variables, and the new concept is, let's say, object orientation. If you are trying to have them decide, oh, wow, these object orientation pieces are going to be much better than storing all my information in individual variables, then you can't do that when you're asking them to only work up to this first major line, because the red prior concept line is going to get them there faster. You have to wait until you're asking them to do this level of task before introducing the concept on the blue line. You have to give it to them at a time when they can authentically make use of those tools. And then lastly, an authentic question. And the more and more I've worked on this, the more I've realized that in computer science, my go-to authentic question is just, which of the 2 ways that I've just shown you do you like better? And asking students for opinions, predictions, and justifications along those lines gets me so much mileage. And in particular, it also humbles me and gives me really good feedback when I've presented a scenario that I thought would be really obvious, but isn't, and actually doesn't make the case for why object orientation would be better, why arrays are going to be better than individual variables. So these are my conclusions. Ask students to study readable, intuitive code, and then solicit predictions. Give them academic vocab only after they understand the utility of the thing that vocab is attached to. Every single word you choose, every string, every variable name, every integer is an opportunity to add context on to your examples. Don't miss those opportunities. And last, not all context is real context. So I have a few final thoughts. 1, this GIF, I know you probably can't see it over Zoom, but this is how coding feels. It's a lot of feelings compressed into a really short time on a loop over and over and over again. And you will be excited and scared and overwhelmed and powerful. And so being aware that our students are in that whirlwind of emotions means that we can't change what's actually going to pop up when students Google something that's really hard. But we can teach our students in ways that affirm their outside expertise. And we can reassure them that when they see foo and bar in the wild and don't understand those examples, that that's the author's fault and not theirs. Not every guide is made with beginners in mind. So thank you to the educators in this virtual room for reminding beginners that they do belong here. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It touches on so many things that we've talked about before, and we just have to keep hammering on because there's so much out there and it's so hard to write these things. We have plenty of time for questions, so please throw your questions in the chat and I will read them out for you. Leo, turn it down. There's a very long question here. I will try to do my justice in here.
I think you've got it, actually.
Well, for the recording, I need to read it.
Great.
So they're a computer science researcher, education researcher, and how they teach programming involves representing real-world objects as data and then operating on that data. They're thrown off by the dog example. Can you explain a little bit better about how the dog example was bad, a bad or inauthentic example? Then I was talking about
Dog, here we go.
That I don't talk about my favorite singers in terms of list access in the real world. So why would the list of artists be a better programmatic example than their presentation of the dog programmatically?
Cool.
And how do you, how do you specifically operationalize authenticity with examples besides giving more meaningful variable names?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I will go back and I will lodge my complaints with the dog class just slightly more formally. I think that the dog is like halfway to context. So to be clear, I don't think it is an atrocity in the same way that I think some of the earlier pieces that I showed, like the My class, it was. But in this situation, some of the frustrations or complaints I have are, one, obviously we need to name these better. These attribute 1 and attribute 2 are just foo and bar in disguise. And then 2, this fun piece, it might be print profile is the name of this method that we're describing here, or print description, and being aware of this. But then the reason that I actually think this is not useful is a little bit one step removed from that. So one, like dogs don't exist in the digital world, but maybe if you wanted to make like a dating site for dogs, and then dog profile would be an object that you might want to instantiate. And then the methods that would come along with it might include like add dog friend. And so I'm seeing a lot of opportunities to take this like seedling of an idea and give it a lot more love and a lot more nourishment to seem way more authentic in terms of what we're creating. In terms of comparing it to, let's go to the lists example, because I thought that was a great question too. I don't think that necessarily the artists existing purely in a list of strings is the best representation, but if you're on day 2 of an immersive course, and so far all they have are individual variables with individual dogs, then the idea that you might want to collect musicians, the idea that they might want to collect them all into one and have a list that you can then move up and down is really, really powerful. So if I accidentally equated the list of artists as an alternative to the dog, I apologize. That wasn't what I was proposing. I was more thinking about this as a step up from the collection of numbers. Thanks. What's next?
Cool. So it also depends on the context of the students as well. Like, K through 12 has varying different interests than scientific students as well. So question is, where do you suggest pulling concrete, tangible examples from? And if you should not be using natural context, what are computer systems maybe?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the most common thing that I do as I go on is spend as much time as I can querying my students every single day. And the deeper I can immerse myself in at least an awareness of what their interests are and what they care about and what problems they're trying to solve, the better able I am to recognize what piece or what role code might play in that with students. And so if it becomes clear to me that my students are starting to latch onto environmental issues as like a core theme for a lot of them, then recognizing, oh, I should find a way to layer on context that relates to that. I think that's the core of what I do.
Great. So next question is, what do you tell your students when they see foo and bar in examples online?
Find a new one. Almost always. That's kind of the core of it. I tell them straight up, foo and bar are examples for folks who already know several programming languages to not have to think very deeply about the programming language they're learning right away. That may be a little bit too dismissive, but I think for a beginner, it's good to know that it's not their fault.
Yeah, sometimes the brute force things are important. Yeah, someone reminds us that not everyone has a pet. There's so many different contexts and situations that students can live inside of. It's, as you mentioned, like surveying students and having a conversation with them and making sure that the lines of conversation and communication are open to hear back I use laundry examples all the time for analogies and stuff, because everyone has to do laundry at some point. So the question is, what has been useful in your own material development process towards making sure you have good examples and your content is accessible? What checks do you place on yourself?
Yeah. This is something that I learned from Danny Fenves, the founder and CEO of Upperline, where I work right now, which is at the end of every single interaction we have with students every single day, no matter what. So if we're doing a 10-day course, we'll do this 10 times in a row. We ask, how was the day? Was it enjoyable, unenjoyable, just okay? Was it easy, medium, hard? What was the best part? What was the worst part? And opening myself up to that feedback every single day is really scary, but it also gives me so much good, some rich feedback to dig into and recognize where I've made mistakes, where I've made assumptions. And so the first day that I did the player class for video games, to be honest, it was better than the example that I was using before then. It was a step in the right direction, but we also looked through and I realized, oh, this very heavily skews along gender lines in a way that is not at all the type of teacher I want to be. So I need to reevaluate.
Awesome. We have a few more minutes for questions. I just want to say that the Carpentries, which has been mentioned before, has, and I'm an instructor trainer for them as well, has some really awesome feedback mechanisms as far as leaving sticky notes for pros and cons and things, and some good strategies for helping, using your co-teachers to help review those for you and provide an executive summary of feedback so you don't see it yourself. So one more comment that's come in, you can make a reasonable dog example, especially when it's of a variety of meaningful contexts. Jeff's larger point of letting foo and bar die quickly is wonderful. I would argue that goes for most experienced programmers as well as beginners. Yeah, this reminds me of a talk I gave last year towards the end. So I'm a librarian by training, and so when I'm looking at the examples and how you search online for help, especially from a beginner's perspective, you have to keep in mind that there's different kinds of resources. So there's, for an experienced person who just needs to remember what was the name of that argument there or what's the order of arguments, they need a very different kind of example than a beginner needing to understand sort of not only what is the structure of a class syntax, but why even do we do it? And helping learners understand that there's different kinds of resources out there can help them give that permission to bail from something that isn't working for them. And another question is probably the last question we have time for. Can you elaborate on the simple example versus clear example?
Yeah, so I won't have time to dig deep into it, but one thing I did write a whole blog post on this. So if you really want to get deep into my thoughts, follow that Medium link on the screen right now. The quick summary and where I realized that was when I taught functions, because the first function I used to teach was one called say hello that printed hello. And we thought of it as the hello world of functions. And what happened is students looked at that example and thought, why? You've just taught me how to do in 3 lines what I used to be able to do in 1. I can already print hello by typing print hello. And when we actually moved it a step further to creating functions that are things like determine movie rating from age and then taking an age as an argument, we found that students were much more able to understand why there might be utility here. And so I used to think the harder a concept was, the simpler it made sense to start. And experience has taught me that students actually respond well to pretty rigorous first examples as long as the context is clear.
Awesome, thank you so much. Can we get a nice emoji round of applause in the chat as we invite Piper to take the floor. Piper, I've made you co-host, so you can go ahead and, so Jeff, if you can turn off screen share. Bye, thank you.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Absolutely, and we can see you too.
Yay. All right. That is not screen 1, but we're gonna go with it. Oh wait, that is the wrong screen, like I thought. All right,
it looks
hold
right.
on.
It looks like your slide.
Oh, on my side, I was seeing my side of the thing shared. So let me try this one more time. Here we go. All right.
Yeah, looks like a slide.
I'm going to attempt to use the captioning. Let me know if that's working.
It's working well. Worked well yesterday.
Okay.
When I used it in my talk, so thank you for using it.
All right. Hi, everybody. I am extremely stressed about this talk since I have written it in a week, have not practiced it nearly enough. thanks for inviting me to this, Elizabeth and the rest of the organizers. This is actually my first Education Summit talk. This is my second time at the Education Summit. Really happy about that. And I'm going to be talking about the fact that my project, Pursued Pi Bear, has embraced a principles-driven development cycle, where what I mean by that is that the way we determine what we're going to work on, what that should look like, and who it's for is based on principles that we have defined, and how we got to this point, considering this started as a solo project about 6 years ago. So I am Piper Sundström. I am currently a software engineer at GLG. I am the author and maintainer of the library. If you want to tweet while you're here, my Twitter handle is @PA_Thunstrom. If you would like the notes to this talk, which are available, github.com/PA_Thunstrom/talk principles driven dev. If you want to follow along that way. I tend to do this because it is easier for people to read sometimes. So, and what I am talking about is Pursued Pi Bear, which is an education-focused game engine. I started this as a solo project. It was sometime in 2016, actually, mostly to reduce the amount of boilerplate I was writing for video games that I was writing for my own personal education. Primarily, I have used video games as a test bed in order to learn more advanced concepts as a software engineer, which it was also one of the things I did as I started learning program. This was mostly as an adult, but after college, I started doing game development to learn how to program. I was actually a business major. Actually, part of that I wanted to cover, as a software engineer and largely as a person, I am effectively self-educated. I was homeschooled from about 8th grade, did correspondence courses or something akin to unschooling. I taught myself whatever that I decided I wanted to learn. I do have a college education, but it is a business degree. It's not an education or software degree. I mostly put that so that we have that context as I talk about all of this. I am self-teaching myself how to reach these points as I go. Oops, sorry. Now, since it was, my personal library, the shift to an education-focused library came through a number of things. Primarily, it was a number of my close friends and one of my partners are educators themselves. And I kept getting the question of like, hey, could you do this, but for education? And after getting that question enough times, I started shifting my ideas and going, well, why couldn't I do that? So I set out to develop this. Sorry about this. All right. So set out to solve that problem. Mostly it was looking around at Python, which is the language I knew and the language that everyone was using, and figuring out how to make game development in Python easier was the goal one. Because for anyone who has tried teaching using Pygame, there's a lot of boilerplate to get to your first functioning game. And so that was the start of the thing. But when I got to the point of realizing that I wanted to solve that problem, I also realized that it was important to at least keep in mind those goals, because I have seen in my own projects, the thing I was shooting for shift a little bit just as I prototype. And I did not want that to happen to this project. So the original principles existed. I actually wrote them in the README shortly after I made the code public. And the start, I'm going to admit that the original principles are flawed in a lot of ways. They are a mix of technical, cultural, and aspirational principles. And they were basically a product of my perspective at the time they were written. And and listed on my slide here, I can talk through them. The principles were basically, it had to be education friendly, and that I didn't actually know what that meant when I started. I actually made the shift from education friendly to education focused as I started talking to more teachers and realized that lots of things can be friendly for education, but very few tools try to focus on the educational use case. I also had to ask myself more than once, like, what do I even mean by education friendly? I did know that from the start that PPB should be idiomatic Python all the way through. Basically, if you write a game in PPB, it should look like other Python code. It shouldn't look like, a good example, there is a game library out there called RenPy, which is actually what we call a domain-specific language. And it basically takes Python and reduces it even further to make the thing they're solving much easier, but it doesn't transfer to other Python code. And I didn't want that roadblock to be in my future. I focused around object orientation and event driven. This is one of my technically oriented principles, and has been a huge place of conflict. Early on, when it was just my project, I'd have game developers question why I would care about object orientation. And my big thing with this was more that because Python is object-oriented at its core, like understanding how Python works is one of those things. The event-driven thing was partially because I find game programming easier with event-driven stuff, and it was also a path to working with code on the web. So transferring some Python skills to JavaScript and web event loops. I wanted it to be hardware library agnostic, fully aspirational. At the time, I was tightly bound to Pygame, and even now, the core project doesn't support anything but what our current backing is. Right now, it's PySDL2. It was previously Pygame, and we are talking about going into the web in sometime in the future. And so we're not actually supporting all of those yet, but like we are built to be able to do that kind of transfer. And the idea of fun was put on here. It was actually added formally later when my eventual co-maintainer made the comment. But it was, I always wanted to have fun using my own library. And these were good for a solo project that mostly I had a handful of, I'll call them consultants, people that I talked to, like, okay, talk to me about the education case so that I don't make a bad decision now. It was good enough to keep me on track, but honestly, these are not well defined, and where they are well defined, they're kind of, they're sources of conflict that I wanted to minimize. So eventually, I met my co-maintainer. We actually met at PyCon a couple of years ago. She came on and built the event system, the real event system, before it was manually calling various things. And one of the big questions our existing principles and the design goals that we had set out for, again, defined mostly by teachers, created conflict. One of the big ones that I remember was the constraints that we had put on a certain feature. I don't remember what the feature was. My co-maintainer went, the number of constraints we've put on this has made the engineering extremely hard. Nowadays, we understand that part of what we as the maintainers of this library are doing is doing all the hard work so that end users don't have to. But we didn't really have a way to say that before because our focuses were not actually well put forward. Then we would also have conflicts about trajectory, because where I was mostly leading PPB as a focused thing, like aiming for education and being willing to make compromises to that end. Other engineers on the project weren't there for that. They were there because they wanted to do the cool game thing, or they were fixing our math libraries or things like that. They had different things that they wanted to see happen. And so choosing what to do next on the project was very hard to like define that in a way that was acceptable to all the stakeholders involved. And the last bit of conflict was that even as we were coming as a group to accept these principles as the things we did, we often would have to explain why we didn't want to discuss a specific potential solution. Usually because it breaks one of the principles that we previously, that I was just discussing. And so that's where we started. Over time, these principles actually evolved. We didn't actually update the README except for fun, mostly because the importance of making the API enjoyable was probably the first thing we identified as a true long-term goal of PPB. It should always be fun to use. It's one of our focuses. Unfortunately, we didn't update the README as these things were happening because really these conversations were either happening in private in the maintainer-only chat, or they were happening specifically between myself and other stakeholders. And while I work really hard to try to keep like the things that I am synthesizing from multiple sources and putting them somewhere, that still leaves a point of failure. And so this wasn't really acceptable long-term to myself or to anyone else in the project. And as I said, we've made calls on these principles that we're slowly modifying over time without having a place to point, like, this is why we're doing it. And like making calls on unwritten things feels not great when you're a community-driven project. And then really we decided it was time to synthesize all of these principles somewhere. And so I set out to write our new principles documentation. PPB 0.8 came out last weekend. Part of that push was some better documentation and these principles documents that really define what we as a project care about. And so we're going to talk about those principles a little bit. I'm going to try to go quickly because really I want to show some examples of this. And so when we rearranged it, the education-focused idea, we realized really actually came down to an idea called students and learners first. This was that boiled down to its component part, the thing that we actually care about when designing our API. We want this suggests things like the discoverability of our API, like how easy is it to like learn how to put different pieces of our system together. Part of it, we have gone out of our way to explicitly recognize that not all learners are necessarily students. I am self-educated. I didn't want to leave those kinds of people behind. And the other thing is that we're students and learners first, but we're not actually exclusively focused on education anymore. Part of keeping PPB maintained and running long-term, we're going to need professional developers and hobbyist developers who are willing to work on it. And so input comes from learners, teachers, those hobbyists, and the core dev team on where our goals are going. So sometimes something we're going to work on is going to be a mostly internal API change that the core dev team needs to be able to continue working, but doesn't necessarily advance one of these other spaces. Another concept that we have nested under students and learners first is an idea called progressive revelation of complexity. We continually work on that first hour or two of working with PPB to make the step from the equivalent of our hello world out to your first video game that you've designed yourself. We're trying to make that essentially a low-grade curve is basically what I'm trying to say. We also have a concept that mostly came from my co-maintainer that we refer to as no apologies. Mostly that is we want our we don't want to have to like apologize for the way we designed the API. If we have to apologize, we're going to go back and try it again. Our second idea is creativity without limits. The only limitations we accept for PPB are the skill cap, are the actual limitations of picking Python as our source language. If you can do it in Python, you can probably do it in PPB. Whether it is performant is another question, but that is all software. We are a code-first game engine. These are actually significantly rare. That is specifically because we care about learning PPB should be learning Python and vice versa. If PPB were a visual code editor first, you don't get that same progression from, oh, I learned PPB and now I can read other code. It's now I have to learn how to read normal code and then go back. And that was one of the things we cared about. Additionally, we try to support all of our user cases, all of our users, which includes the teachers, the hobbyists, and so on. Fun is still just a single word, but it is actually a fairly complex idea. In the short term, fun is the principle that guides our API design. We think that PPB should be delightful to use. We are, the maintainers especially are user experience developers first. We want our software to be pleasant to use. We want to design it to encourage playful experimentation, to be a test bed for trying out new things. And we want it community focused. And radical acceptance is another one of those. This is big and complex. I'm only going to go over it very quickly. PPB is a living project. Change is critical to this project. We have to be willing to go back and try again. We want the input into PPB to be as diverse as possible. I am actually really proud most of our contributors are women at the moment. This is not so much that this is what we focused on, it's just we have done really well in allowing that. Diversity of gender, of experience, of you name it, this is the kind of inputs we want to see in PPB. And we also include inclusion under that same heading with the like, people who are our users are also part of our community, and we don't want to push out new contributors the way some open source projects have been known to in the past. All right, so I'm going to go through 3 examples really quick, mostly because I think principles are great, but if you're not living your principles, they don't really matter in the long term. And so these are basically a demonstration of how these principles I've just mentioned affect the way we code. So the first one is, this is the hello world of PPB. On the left is the old style. This is about as reduced as I could get it when we exposed the game engine as the entry point. It was my co-maintainer who suggested making it possible to do the thing on the right. The run function does a lot of magic for us. It allows you to just throw things at the engine and it kind of works. But because of this, it is now 2 lines to hello world, which is, I'm not going to run the demo for you, but this opens a window for you. From there, we would actually, okay, without going too much farther here, previous versions of PPB, even before this old-fashioned one that I show you here, was much, much harder, hard enough that it was hard for me to keep the system in my head, which is why our new API even exists. In general, this is kind of a sign of we've slowly identified the complexity in that first hour of a user's time and try to push it down through helper functions and sensible defaults. And these changes kind of took being unafraid to throw away code. As I mentioned, even older than this old model, there was another API. It was so bad, I threw out the code base entirely and started over. then we move on to this is the minimum viable PPB game. It is 12 lines of code. This has a object on screen, chase the mouse, and that's it. That's all it does. To get from the previous example to here, though, you have to learn functions and how to define them. You have to learn classes and how to define them. And you have to actually get an idea of what events do. We're not totally happy with this step. It's missing a handful of defaults. Like, there are things that we wish we could do to make this simpler, and honestly, having to rewrite this same 15 lines of code, while it's a lot more than you would get for the same 12 to 15 lines of Pygame code, it's still kind of tiring to do this over and over again for your early prototypes. So the living it part of this is we actually want to start including sprites that do some basic features like this out of the box. So you just add a sprite that it can follow an object. You just tell it which object to follow. Move to a target. You give it a position, it'll move to that position. Mouse movement like this one, where you just pass it, you just add the class to the scene and you're done. Or you add an instance of the class to the scene and you're done. And this is about reduce that minimum functioning game to about 4 lines, which will be a step in the right direction. Really, again, the goal is to provide that ramp from the most simple example to the next most simple example, and so on and so forth throughout the learning thing. And the last thing I want to talk about is project governance. This is where a lot of the inclusion and community-driven principles come into play. When I set out on PPB, it was my project, but shortly after it became I'm doing something for a community, I knew I didn't want to be BDFL. When I created the PPB Python org, or the PPB GitHub org, excuse me, I actually created a team that I called Oversight. Essentially, it is eventually going to be something equivalent to the Python Languages Steering Committee. It's still just me. We're changing that over time. But even before the GitHub organization, like, I didn't really make decisions in a vacuum. I would build a prototype and put it in front of one of the teachers I knew and went, look at this and tell me if this is the right track, or here are a couple of alternatives I considered. I've been a hobbyist game developer for 8 years. Felt their needs are kind of covered by the fact that there's a lot of them involved in the actual development. For me, students are actually the hardest part to get feedback from. I need help with that. We recently had our first advertised strategy meeting. In attendance, there were 2 educators, a grad student, 2 core devs, and a hobbyist game dev. This is small. It was a last-minute plan. Mostly, I want these meetings to continue to have that diverse membership, a mix of educators and students with the core development team, so that we can make our plans. The results of that is we have just figured out the set of features that we want over the next couple of months. We do about quarterly releases right now, focusing on text rendering, those default sprites I mentioned, and some performance enhancements. I, as a maintainer, my new project is getting our tutorials up to snuff. And then we also got to talk about strategic projects. Mostly this is around distribution. Things like a friend of the project is running a thing called the Feet Python Runner, which they compared to the Love 2D model, if anyone is aware of that. We also have added PPB to the briefcase from Beware Cookie Cutter, so you can use briefcase to package PPB games. We'll do further testing on that. And the other thing that is on our plate that we want to start in the next 6 months is getting Pursued by Bear on the web. That was a decision that was basically everyone at that meeting thought that was the thing we need to make happen. All right, so conclusions here. Yeah, this is a solo project that became a community-driven one. It's our principles that have helped us become what we are. I have made sure our principles doc is now a living document and not hidden in our heads. You can read it in the documentation. And here's how you can reach me or the project. I don't know if we have time for questions, Elizabeth.
We do have a couple minutes for questions.
Okay. I'm willing to answer a few.
Yeah, so as usual, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in chat and I'll read them out for the recording. While people are typing that up, thank you so much. That was really good. It was really fascinating to see all of the background, and I love the principles of keeping the learners first, and clarity is so important because we lose that. And educators are so often just sort of fighting with whatever we can get and making it work. And developers are also doing the same sort of thing in the background, and I love creating and fostering those connections between everyone here. So thank you so much for showing. And I love your minimum viable example. It's actually really readable. I mean, I don't know what the heck's going on, but oh, okay, I can make some sort of gist sense of those functions in there.
Just to go back on that, in general, because we're event driven, it was actually Meg Ray who made the final decision on what our event handlers look like. So on mouse motion, on update, we have made it, all event handlers in PPB are on the name of an event, and events are literally just classes. So you can define your own in the system and figure out what the handler is going to look like just based on how you named it.
Yeah. And it's super clear in the code and with your design perspectives that you've had educators as part of this process as well. So there is a question in here. Are there any pool of resources that are off-the-shelf compatible to be used in PPT or PPB? Yeah.
So right now there are not. That is my next 6 months to a year is making those exist. Unfortunately, I am not. I teach. I am not an educator of that sense. I don't teach in classrooms. I tend to do tutorials. So I want to get with some teachers who can give some input, direction, whatever. I am willing to listen and try to build what is needed to make this something you can use off the shelf.
Awesome, thank you. So one more question. I think this is the time we just have one more question. Thank you for sharing the journey. Is there a showcase page or a list of projects that have been built with this?
Not yet. Also on, again, the next 6 months to a year, we've been talking about a gallery of projects. I do have a handful that I show people. So if you want to reach out to me, I can link you directly to some of the projects I've been building. But we do have some hobbyist game devs building some very cool things, and we want to be able to show those off.
Awesome, thank you so much. Can we get an awesome chat show of applause for Piper for presenting? And thank you so much for my last minute invitation making this work. I know it's hard and you did great.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool, okay, thank you so much. Matthew Jansen, I've gone ahead and made you a co-host, so you can go ahead and share your video, audio, and share your screen. So we're going to be moving into our lightning talk round next. So we have 2 lightning talks, one from Matthew Jansen and one from Meg Ray. And then either we have just open discussion for people, or we have some breakout rooms we can actually use this time. So we might do that. But for now, let's get Matthew going. And all right, take it away.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep, and I see your slides.
Awesome, great. Unmute was hanging for a second. So, hi, I'm Matt Jansen. I'm the data analysis librarian at UNC Chapel Hill. First time attendee, first time education summit and all that. So I'm really happy to be here, and I've enjoyed all the talks so far. And today I'm going to talk very briefly about a couple of the challenges we faced in our Python instruction, the kind of situation we're in, and what we've done to alleviate those challenges so far, where we're headed, and I'm eager to get feedback and thoughts from the attendees. So first, a bit of background. So I am part of Digital Research Services. We are a group inside the University Libraries at UNC Chapel Hill. We are in a very kind of generic academic library setting where we have many librarians who have subject specialties in various areas. Our unit focuses on data, so we're a group of data librarians. Most of us are librarians kind of by affiliation, but not by training. So I know there's been several other people with library backgrounds here so far today. And many of the people, a few of the people in our department are information science, library science people, but we've also got geographers and American studies people, and my background's in stats. So we're a mixed department, and we support data science across UNC. So by that, I mean everything of data discovery through to communication results or visualization, and all the things along the way. We have particular strength in geospatial data. So our big tool sets are really Python and R, and GIS, and Tableau, and of course some Excel backing all that up. So as I said before, our audience is basically everybody at UNC and occasionally members of the general public. We are a public university, so we don't close our doors to anybody. So we do occasionally get companies in from other parts of the area and stuff like that. And we keep our doors open to that, but it means we have a very, very broad audience for these workshops. So a little bit about how we provide services to these groups. So we do workshops, we do one-on-one consultations, and we have walk-in services. We collaborate with a few other groups on campus to do this. So we really kind of, we provide several different levels. We think about it as a tiered service setting of kind of a very broad instructional setting that's backed up by more in-depth in-person and also scarcer resources for these one-on-one interactions. So coming into our workshops, we really think about our attendees as falling into these three main groups I've got on the screen. We always have a few people who kind of the extent of what they've done with data before is at the level of Excel functions. So they've done some sums, they've done some averages, they've done a VLOOKUP, and that's kind of where they are, and they're looking to make that step over into something else that would be a little more powerful or give them new options. Then we get people from the two sides of the kind of stats and data versus programming/CS coin. So we get people who are coming over who know Java or something like that and want to use Python to do data science, as it were. And we get people who know SAS or Stata and want to learn Python to get more of those computer science benefits. We get people from all over the place that come to these big open workshops. So now that I've said a little bit about our attendees, let's talk about our goals. So as I said, we do these one-on-one consultations, so we really don't aim to have people come out of these with a full skill set. We really just want to get people to the phase where they can start to experiment a little on their own, and then we can serve them in that one-on-one setting in whatever they're doing. So that could be any variety of things. I've seen more Python packages in this position than I ever thought I would. We really have a lot of little pockets of Python users in different departments. We have people doing psychological experiments with Python. We have people doing genomic stuff. We have people doing various things with the web and really just a lot of baseline, pandas users and stuff like that. And a lot of these people are not well supported in their departments, so they're kind of isolated, the one or two people doing it in their department, and they need help from an outside agency, and we're kind of looking to fill that role. We're also hoping selfishly to replace some of the one-on-one meetings we've historically had to explain basic concepts. So somebody's in a class and they don't understand what an object is or what loops are, and we want to basically try to divert some of that flow into workshops. So that all impacts how we have structured our workshops. So into our challenges. So the first major challenge is, as I've already harped on a fair amount, variety. So we have so many different people, so many different backgrounds who show up to these. We don't currently have the capacity or ability to separate people into different groups based on their kind of use cases. So we really want something that's going to hit a really wide variety of people. So to do that, we have over the years triangulated towards multi-week workshops. We're kind of headed in the direction of a full-time course. We're not there, and these are all not for credit courses. They're just workshops. But we need that multi-week structure to really let people digest things as they go along, because this isn't one of their core course responsibilities. It's something that's extra for almost everybody who's coming. So we have borrowed this Open Labs format from Columbia University. We first implemented this for R in 2017. And we've been teaching that format in R since 2017. And in the past year and a half or so, we've been implementing this into Python. So the basic model is that the first half of these workshops is the more kind of formal instruction time. The second half is open-ended. So we have, we'll provide more kind of exercises and challenges for people in line with the content from the day. We'll provide time for them to work on the project that made them come to these workshops in the first place, right? The thing that's related to the research, or homework, or also some extras. So we develop material around particular topics that are not of interest to everybody, but would be of interest to large subsets, things like geospatial data, text analysis, stuff like that we don't have time for in the main stuff. We've also in the past semester been angling towards what we're calling our Python 0 redesign. So we're taking a couple workshops at the beginning away from the open format to really focus on fundamentals, and we do that in more of a workshop format so that we can get those people, particularly the people coming from an Excel background or a stats background, some of the basic just kind of computer concepts, things like file paths and stuff like that, and allow people who have more background in that to enter in at the Open Labs transition where we really focus in more on data. So the other challenge incumbent in all of this is if we're going to do all this one-on-one help built into the workshops, we need more capacity. So I've spent a fair amount of time in the past few years recruiting colleagues into this. So many of my colleagues are librarians. Some have some experience with Python. I'm generally I use Python the most of the people in my department, but I'm not the only one using it. But I often get but you're the expert pushback. So I've fought that in a couple ways. One, we've had a couple examples of staff who have really picked up Python and come in and taught. One of whom is one of my colleagues who is who historically is very much traditional librarian among our department of helps people find data. That is her primary role. And over the past couple of years, she has moved into helping with instruction. She actually taught parts of the introduction to Python this past semester. And in that process, she's really been very successful at connecting to the new learners, right? It gives a new perspective. It adds diversity to the number of perspectives that we're coming from, because we're getting more people who are other people who are working in the libraries who focus on different subject areas have these different backgrounds to bring to the table, different perspective, different examples that connects to our variety. The other argument is really the culture of growth idea. So we as an organization are lucky that we have communities of practice in the organization to allow us to use work time to build up skills in different areas. And within my department, we've devoted several hours each Monday to research and development time. So within that time, we have the flexibility to learn new things. That's how some of my colleagues have been able to get involved in this. So that has really been crucial and something we've been advocating for at an organizational level. So long story short, I've been able to recruit several people into this. So as of our previous, we started out maybe 3 years ago, was the last time that I did this by myself. And we're now up to 7 people who are teaching, several people from within my department. We've also brought in people from outside the libraries and some graduate students who are either teaching or helping us develop materials or exercises. And it has really, really brought us a long way in terms of the diversity of perspectives that we're bringing and the impact we're able to have with these. So that's it. Got my email up here if anybody has questions or feedback down the line, and I'm happy to answer questions via chat, etc. as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Go ahead and throw your questions in chat. We have a couple minutes for questions. This is awesome. Thank you. I used to work in research data management, librarianship myself, and have a chapter on like how to build sustainability in data science education in libraries, because it is hard.
Yeah.
It's so hard, and there's so much need. I know, baby. Okay. Yeah.
Several of our, we've definitely had some other departments on campus that have fallen victim to poaching and stuff like that too. So there's a definite sustainability angle we didn't touch on here. Of more chefs in the kitchen means that one chef disappearing doesn't ruin the enterprise.
The unicorn chef is a problem as well. All right. I'll talk to you about unicorns after we're done. Sorry. All right, any questions? We have probably time for 1 or 2 questions.
Someone has to get their eye out.
So I'm going to read the questions just to have them on the recording. Even ever thought about streaming these workshops with Slack or chat or with remote participation?
Yeah, so that is definitely on our agenda at the moment. We did a little bit of our instruction remotely. Our Python series was done by the time everything shut down here, but I think we will very much be thinking about stream and remote participation for these things in the future. And I think in that direction, it really kind of comes around to you can have a more global community of practice here, and what bigger movements to tie into with that. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting change on that in the next several months. We aren't sure if we're going to be in person or anything in the fall, so we may be doing that whether we like it or not. But so far we haven't done it because it has been just an extra thing, and we're trying to get things settled. And we like the in-person thing of helping people troubleshoot, just getting stuff installed. That's another big barrier to entry for a lot of people.
Great, thank you. I do want to refer to, once they're up on YouTube, the Carpentries gave a presentation at the Trainer Summit yesterday about their pilot program and guidelines for adapting their in-person model to online as well. So there's a question in here of curious how you end up doing with learners who are interested in learning to code but have that 6 to 8 week lead time before they can start seeing success. How has the model been for keeping learners motivated and engaged, building community, etc.?
Yeah. So some of it is we really do push people towards having some sort of project where they can start to see something early on, and we do. This is one of the places where we benefit with the ability to spin out one-on-one meetings. Many of the people who are coming here, we have a lot of people who have an outside.
Let me have my pen so I can fix this.
So they have an outside incentive, and their professor says that their advisor says, "Oh, you've got to learn this to do this," and they're trying to do a specific problem. It is a challenge though. Retention is always a challenge through the semester. We try to time this out so it's early enough in the semester that we always lose people at the end. So we have to start these very early on, but not too early that people can't get in. So that's definitely a challenge, and I don't think we have a silver bullet answer for this. We've been trying to build community, and that has been one of our big challenges here. And we've had some successes, but we have some people who show up and sit for the workshop and then leave. We have some people who will talk to the neighbors. It's a particular challenge because we have faculty members and undergrads, and kind of sometimes getting those groups to intermix can be challenging. So I don't have a particular great answer for that. If anybody else in the chat does.
I think it's a universal problem, and it depends on like the mechanisms and culture of each campus as well.
Yeah.
Short course classes can help sometimes if it's available. So one last question is, they're a GIS professional, and can you please share some resources which can help develop a GIS data analytics application?
So that's, yeah, that's a big question. I actually don't do as much with GIS as some of my colleagues. So one of the other people involved in our instruction is our specifically GIS librarian. So I often am kind of coming in on the edges. I would say that one of the really neat places to get started for a lot of people coming in from a general data use standpoint in Python is GeoPandas. So it's just pandas kind of with some geographic stuff put on top of it. So it kind of comes from most people have used pandas before if you're working with data already, and it makes things a little more familiar than going all the way into like looking at GDAL or something like that. But there's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of different kind of ecosystems out there in GIS. So it can be a little challenging to know the right one, or the easiest one for you, or the best one to work with the ones that you're, whatever system you guys are working in, if you're a QGIS shop or an ArcMap shop or whatever. So.
Awesome. Sorry. Thank you so much for that. And can we get a big chat round of applause and emoji, show of emoji? Thank you so much for that. And I will invite, so Meg, I've made you co-host in here, so you should be able to share your video, audio, and slides as needed.
Excellent, thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Let me just get the slides pulled up. Here we go.
Got it, looks great.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm really excited to be joining today. Unfortunately, I am only able to join for this lightning talks portion, but I'm excited to watch the recording and hear all the ideas that come out of this today. So today I'm going to talk about a new PSF project that we're using #PythonEDU. Last year, I was awarded one of the PSF Python in Education grants to create a landing hub for education. As all of you know who are here, our education community is growing. We have a great sense of community, and there are so many people asking for education resources. So this is a space housed by the PSF where we can continue that community throughout the year. Oh, I got ahead of myself here, announcing the Python education landing page. So what will be on this? First of all, we want to incorporate what we're already doing, right, and make sure that that remains the foundation of our education community. So like I said, this website, the project's founded by the PSF and it will be housed by the PSF. It will be an open source project. So I am definitely looking for contributors. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Oh, I didn't change this yet. So the timeline on this project has been changed with everything going on. The PSF and I have worked on a new timeline. So there will be a teaser site that goes up in mid-October. During the time between now and mid-October, I'm going to be doing some preliminary setup. Basically, the old site is in Python 2, and it uses an open source library that I'm not sure how long it will be supported. So I'm porting everything to Python 3 and using Flask. And then I'll get a dev server set up and we'll get the teaser site out. And during that time, I'm hoping there will be people who are interested in that piece of it and want to jump on board to help with that in the summer. But then the next phase after that will be really about building out some of the fun tech features of the site and also building the content for the site. So hopefully we'll have a range of contributors on the tech side and on the education side to contribute to all of that. So what will be on the site? Vetted Python education resources. Everyone's like, why don't we have these in one place? So we'll do that, and we'll leverage some existing repositories that are being built in the wider CSED community, but of course focused on Python. We'll have some templates to help guide people who are creating open education resources so that the resources are really usable by educators. We'll have some getting started guides for different types of trainers and educators, and we'll also have equity toolkits so that if you're training people from different populations who have been traditionally marginalized in computer science and in programming, we'll have some toolkits to help widen our Python circle, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And we want to use it as a space to really build community, keep this sense of community going year round. So the new launch will be at PyCon 2021. let's see. And there is also a possible phase 2, depending on how the popularity and reception of the site. There are a number of additional features that we'd like to build out following the launch. Okay, so this is really about keeping our circle wide. So who is the education site for? Everyone interested in Python education. It's a global community. I am really, in particular, looking for contributors from around the world, so that it's not just me making it US centric. This is a really important piece of it. This is for people who train in K-12, in higher ed, and adults. It's for both formal, like in-classroom educators and informal educators. If you're a boot camp or corporate trainer, it's for you. If you do this as an independent contractor, it's for you. It's for people who get paid for Python education and people who are volunteers. For people doing this informally, you're mentoring someone at work, you're a parent and you want your child to learn. It's also for people developing tools for EdTech, especially coding education, Python education, product developers, programmers, etc. Spelling error. It's for writers, people writing books and tutorials, and of course, all types of learners. Okay, and then before I wrap up, so I work in K-12 education in New York City, and one thing I've been doing is supporting teachers in switching over to remote teaching and in helping address equity issues in remote teaching. So because that's something that's been on my mind, I wanted to share with you some tips for keeping Python education accessible during this pandemic and beyond. So these are just some things I've learned over the last month in doing this work. So teachers more than ever are relying on free open education resources, and then a lot of companies who have paid curriculum and resources are making them available for free through the summer, and that has made a huge difference. So if you have a product or curriculum, having it be free. If you have a cool thing that you're doing and you can turn it into an open education resource, or you can throw it up online, that would help keep things accessible. If you're doing any development of these types of tools, focus on developing for coding in the browser and for coding on tablets and phones. I know that's not ideal. No one wants to code on a phone, but that's some of our students, many of our students only link to their classes and their learning right now. If you are somebody who posts open-ended projects, hey, here's a cool thing that I did with the Raspberry Pi. If you can add any kind of what we call an education scaffolding, right? Any kind of guidance for that project, that would really benefit learners and educators. If you know any teachers, and you can, especially at teachers who maybe aren't used to using as much technology, I've been telling people, solve one problem that they have and teach them the technology that solves that one problem. So baby steps. Let's see. If you are able to donate technology, donate it directly to a school or a community organization. There are still kids all over the country who don't have remote access. And and the local schools and local community are best equipped to know who those students are and get it to them. Right now we have a huge divide between kids who are learning online in a very rich learning environment and kids who are receiving huge math packets that they have to work through on paper. And it's just really increasing inequities. And lastly, let's use this as an opportunity for all of us to be thought partners and think about how we want to change education in general for the better. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. I would love it if everyone here wanted to join me as a contributor to the Python in Education website hub. There are multiple ways that you can reach out to me and get involved. One is on the new mailing list, education@python.org. This is specifically the mailing list for that website. You can also reach me on Twitter. You can tweet about this with the hashtag, and then you can also reach me directly by email. Just keep in mind there is some runway for us to recover a bit from current events. So things will be taking off slowly and then picking up midsummer. All right, so I am happy to take any questions, comments, ideas, etc.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for putting that last slide in there about how to help right now. As I was debating about trying to run this virtually, I was thinking like, this is the hardest time to run this, but we need this the most right now to make sure our community is coming together, helping each other share expertise and strategies and things. So if you have a question, please go ahead and throw it in the chat, and I'll read them out for the purposes of the recording.
One thing I forgot to say is, if you are donating technology, laptops and Chromebooks are really needed, because there may be kids who are connected by a cell phone or a shared tablet that could really benefit from an actual Chromebook or laptop.
Excellent, thank you. There's a couple other comments about Chromebooks in here.
Oh,
so as you're building this hub out, what is your greatest area of need?
So two areas. One is the late summer, early fall port to Python 3. I've worked in Flask before, but I haven't done a full port from 2 to 3. So anybody who has experience with that and is interested in that side, I really need the assistance. And then the second one is the content. I really want the content to represent the entire range of our community, and that's something that I can't do alone. So that's also a big need.
Super true. Awesome. Is it okay if I go ahead and make a Slack channel about this project in the Python Educator Slack?
Please do.
Yeah, we have gained about 20 people over the past 2 days between the Trainers Summit and between this. So and it's at least collecting people temporarily.
And yes, and because that is so active, I definitely, we want to make sure that, you know, it works together and doesn't like replace that, because it's such a positive, active community now.
Yeah. And there's one comment from Eric as well, that this is a topic that has come up in every education summit that I've seen. There is just this resource diaspora, little bit of pieces everywhere, and it's so hard to understand the audience and context and quality of the materials that are coming out, especially since there's like these big corporate actors coming into play. And I think the beauty of our community is we are so open access, open source first. And I will post the Python Educators Slack invite link back in the chat. Heather, we still have a couple, time for more questions for Meg. Go ahead and throw your questions in while I get the Slack invite. Oop, that was the wrong, that thing did not copy. There's the join link there. Or there's the, yeah. Yeah, and then Meg, you and I had discussed earlier, like in the before times, some efforts to maybe start collecting things along the way and collecting them in a way that in 6 months' time, in the after time, we can, all of the metadata and the breadcrumbs will be there for us to like make sure everything's still organized.
And actually, that's another need I have. Some people, contributors with database experience, some of the more advanced features that we're hoping will be funded in the future need us to start with a foundation this year. And I don't know everything about that. So I definitely need people who are doing that. My husband Silas is on board for that piece, but also needs other contributors.
So Zoe rightfully pointed out, I put the wrong Slack invitation in, so please do not join that Slack that I just put in. Please join the one I'm about to put in. There you go. No one wants to hear the rantings of faculty in that Slack group, so sorry.
Love it. The homework collision.
There's so
right
many
now.
Slack groups now.
Yeah.
And it all looks the same. I'll have to figure out how to boot people if I need to. Please don't join that Slack group. All right. I have also been super excited to see that this project, it's grinding slowly because that's just the nature of these things, but it is going and it is got it's got momentum, and we need to keep the community connected and involved to sort of keep even small amounts of momentum going.
Yes.
So we have hope for the after times.
Yes, and so if you're interested now, go ahead and sign up for the mailing list, reach out to me so I can put you on it either by Twitter or email. That way, when things really do get up and running, I can send you updates until that happens, and two, I can reach out to you and let you know as soon as things are moving.
Great. And right now, I think unfortunately, the Slack channel might be one of the easiest ways to.
That's great.
To do that, to send those things. So I don't know about getting a mailing list at some point, but
join that
what we
Slack
got,
channel.
and it's imperfect, but it's what we have. So
I'll collect from all over, and we'll do it.
Perfect, wonderful. All right. If there's no other questions for Meg, I think we have a little bit more time, and we still have some of our previous speakers come in.